Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the fanfiction guy. Back with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku Was Demon Lord Jr. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Deku. That was Uraraka, looking at him curiously. You've been on your phone a lot. Is everything alright? Echa? I'm just following the news, Izuku stammered, holding up his phone to show the Mizutofu Times front page. The Tartarus breakout and all. It was partly true at least. All for One had escaped the prison less than 24 hours ago, freeing most of the other prisoners in the process, some without their quirks. But his browser wasn't the only thing he had open. Unknown number, +8 14547741111. 610, Izu. He'd gotten the text at dawn, just when he woke up. If the number wasn't enough of an indication, the nickname was. Izuku had met All for One before, you see. Izuku, 613. Yes? It hadn't been the best time in his life, back then. 618. I'm calling on a past favor. You know the one. Midoriya Hisashi had not taken well to having a son even before he believed Izuku to be quirkless. Fire-breathing quirk aside, there was no household in Mizutofu that went through as much burn cream as the Midoriya's apartment. Never enough to warrant a hospital visit after the time 3-year-old Izuku supposedly stuck his arm in the stove, but he'd grown used to stinging scars on his arms and back long before Kaken got control over his quirk. Dr. Tsubasa had said it was unlikely that Izuku would be a late bloomer, but possible. He had the second toe joint, but blood tests at Hisashi's behest had suggested a latent quirk, one with no obvious commutations. When Izuku passed his 6th birthday without showing his mysterious ability, Hisashi had decided it needed to be encouraged to manifest. Long story short, it didn't work. Izuku, 620, WH. What do you need? Hisashi grew bored of him eventually, and in some ways that was just as bad. Forgot to leave leftovers for Izuku in the fridge, so they'd go bad on the counter overnight. He didn't notice when groceries ran out. He would get urgent calls from his office and disappear for days on end, while Mom was busy with her own job, and Izuku would wake up to a cold and silent house, alone. After the first time, he'd learned to expect it, and by the third time, he came to appreciate the PRDS of isolation, even when they meant subsisting on tap water and what scraps of food might or might not remain in the house. He learned to spend as much time as possible in the computer lab of the public library, outside school hours. It, like many public buildings, was open 24/7, more to accommodate heroes on the day shift than people with nocturnal quirks, but civilians were allowed in all the same. 10-year-old Izuku ignored hunger pangs and sleep deprivation headaches to plumb the depths of the internet, from hero forums to conspiracy boards to their darknet subboards, some of which were far easier to find than one might expect. Nobody offline had noticed Izuku was smart, but in hindsight, it was no wonder Akatani Mikamo, alias Yamikamo, had been treated like a college student by other board regulars. Izuku found he adored the conspiracy boards. Between the lines of obviously fake, popular conspiracies, in the shadows of urban legends, threaded into true crime mysteries, there lay grains of truth and danger, patterns unseen, connections undrawn, at least on the mainstream internet. Yamikamo only ever asked idle questions on those boards, safe questions. Safe knowledge. The unsafe knowledge went to the darknet, where it belonged. And the really unsafe things, the truth and danger that Izuku hoarded for a purpose, those were either in his analysis notebooks or never written down at all. Either way, no one would ever see them. Then he turned 11 and found the last piece of the puzzle that he was looking for. He was 11 Anaday when he stepped into a darkened alleyway for a meeting. 11 Ana week when he knocked on the door of an abandoned warehouse for another. 11 and 10 days when his objective, at last, was fulfilled. List of unsolved disappearances since 20XX, by country. This list is incomplete. You can help by expanding it. Japan. Midoriya, Hisashi Fire Breath Mizutofu 22XX. Izuku had hovered over the Suggest and Edit button for hours, but ultimately closed the tab and cleared his browser. It wasn't an unsolved disappearance, but he was the only one who needed to know where Hisashi had gone. Unknown number, +814547741111. 624. At lunchtime, you'll get a phone call from your mother. Play along. That had been the last message in the morning, and now it was almost noon. Izuku headed to the cafeteria with his friends, eyes still on his phone. Waiting. And sure enough, just as he was relaxing enough to take a bite of lunch rush's katsudon. Call from accept decline. Sorry guys, my mom is calling, I'll see you later dash. Izuku fled the cafeteria, hitting accept the moment he was somewhere relatively quiet. Hi mom. Izuku, you won't believe who's come to visit. Mom was right. He didn't believe it. Midoriya Hisashi had been dead for years. So then, play along. Midoriya Hisashi had been dead for years. So then, play along. Dado. That's great mom, Izuku managed after a second. Sorry, it's a little loud by the cafeteria so I didn't hear you clearly. Let me find a quieter spot dash. One where the security cameras wouldn't pick up all the expressions his face was running through while he forced down what felt like a panic attack in favor of feigning enthusiasm. 15 minutes later, his friends all looked up at Izuku's return to the cafeteria. Some took more notice than others of the shaky smile on his face and the vigor with which he scarfed down his cold katsudon. Am I dad's back from overseas? Izuku lied at last to his curious tablemates. He's a little bit intense? Shudo sent him a look. Not that bad. Izuku exclaimed. It's just been a long time since I saw him dash, a handful of years and several meters of dirt separated. Izuku from Midoriya Hisashi, and I'm kind of nervous to meet again? As he ought to be, since the Midoriya Hisashi picking him up from UA for a family bonding weekend was all for one. And it was Friday afternoon, so that was 3 hours from now. Oh God. He's coming to campus to pick me up after classes let out, Izuku said aloud, for the benefit of those not tuned into his internal screaming. Ooh. So we all get to meet him. Uraraka beamed. Don't be fooled so easily, Shudo deadpanned. This is just the latest scheme to obfuscate All Might's fatherhood. Izuku snorted. You know that isn't true, he teased weakly. We've talked about this, Shudo. You've never talked about your real dad though, Uraraka pointed out. So what's his quirk like? Is it similar to superpower? Well, fire breath was a straightforward elemental emitter-type quirk typical to 3rd and 4th generation users, using a passively produced accelerant stored in glands in the mouth and throat for fuel. The user could produce a quantity of flame from their mouth at will. Izuku's observations suggested the flame's size and temperature could be controlled to a limited extent, and that the user could direct the outburst with their tongue. The quirk also incorporates a full-body resistance to fire and heat damage. Izuku went on, encouraged by the attention of his audience, the middleman he'd reached out to on the darknet. With several patches on knees and elbows roughly equivalent to finely armored scales. But that may be an aesthetic mutation. I've never met anyone from that side of the family. And while he doesn't seem to know it, he added, the accelerant can also be spit out without igniting it, kind of like a cobra dash. Izuku didn't know how far, because Hisashi had only ever done that while he was drunk and angry, and evaporates quickly, which along with the smell indicates its composition is most likely an alcohol. Which, if it were an alcohol, would also imply a high tolerance for the stuff, and tracked with how much Hisashi spent on liquor when he went out to get wasted. But I'm sure this is all redundant, to, sense some a dash. From his left, there came a sudden crackling of static. Izuku turned and saw that one of the TV screens in the abandoned meeting room had lit up. And why, inquired a low, distorted voice, is that? Izuku swallowed, and quickly composed the thoughts that had swirled around his head for months. He's said to be able to give and take quirks, but anyone who's ever made a deal claims to have met him in person, which means there's unlikely to be an external storage mechanism, and so quirks must be passing through his own body. The rumors say he's lived since the dawn of quirks, if not longer, and quirks back then were notoriously all or nothing, so both his and those he collected would have been highly volatile and powerful, but he's still alive, so then there must be ways to nullify conflicting mutations or else to selectively express them. Because mutant quirks are an arbitrary category in the first place, so there's no reason they wouldn't also be subject to his quirk, or else nothing about fire breath would interest Sensei-sama at all, not to presume what he likes. The middleman was staring at him with wide eyes. Izuku caught his breath, realized he'd been talking a mile a minute, and went red. "I'm sorry for rambling," he bowed anxiously. "It's harder to organize my thoughts when I don't write them down, but it seemed irresponsible to leave any records dash." "You need not apologize, young one," said the screen. "It has been many years since I had occasion to hear an analysis of my own quirk. The novelty is rather refreshing." Izuku blinked as the implication registered. "Sensei-sama." Thank you? It's nice to meet you." "The pleasure is mine, Akatani Mikumo. But, Sensei, is the name I give to strangers. As we will be doing business together soon, I instead invite you to call me All for One." By the time the last class ended for the day and he'd organized his backpack for the weekend, Izuku had managed to will away the nervous knot in his stomach, employing the same sort of compartmentalization that he'd used for other terrible things he needed to hide from people over the years. His friends were more or less fooled by the sunny smiles and false confidence Izuku emitted after lunch, with Shudo the only exception, but there was nothing Izuku wanted to say to him about the current situation, particularly not before he got to see the situation at home for himself. All Might had been out all day for a string of meetings with the Tartarus Task Force and its cooperating hero agencies. Ironic, considering their person of interest was on his way to UA at this very moment. But it was a blessing on Izuku's sanity, for sure. He still hadn't decided what he would do if his mentor and Hisashi met face to face, though that would likely happen sooner rather than later, his luck being what it was. For now, though, it was Principal Nedzu and Aizawa-sensei who waited with Izuku at the school gates for his dad to arrive. They were both sneaking regular glances in his direction. Hopefully, he looked like he was vibrating with excitement rather than nervous anticipation, but neither staff member voiced any concerns aloud. Izuku checked his phone, where another message from All for One, now added to his contacts as Dad, because Izuku was nothing if not diligent when it came to hiding dark truths, had arrived a few minutes ago. "Dad, +814547741111. 15:20 ETA 10 minutes. It was just about 15:30 now, he saw, and sure enough, just as the clock ticked over, a car pulled up on the street by the gates. Izuku recognized the make and model from a recent lesson on civilian protection details, one of the American brands of quirk-resistant armored cars, popular with CEOs, diplomats, and government officials. From the way both Nedzu and Aizawa stiffened, that detail hadn't escaped them either. Aizawa turned to Izuku, opening his mouth like he meant to ask him something. "What did you say your father does for a living, Izuku?" "Oh, I didn't say anything, Sensei." But before he could start that conversation, the driver's side door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, pocketing the keys as he approached. All for One looked more like Izuku than Hisashi ever had. Had he availed himself of a disguise quirk that used Izuku as the base? Was he fully healed underneath, or was the damage Izuku had seen on previous occasions still there, just hidden away? He didn't have any medical equipment on him that Izuku could see, though, and he'd driven a car just fine, so more than likely the restoration was genuine. Izuku clamped down hard on the urge to mutter, that would not happen within earshot of two pro heroes and the constantly recording UA security system, and refocused his attention on his supposed dad, who'd reached the gates in about 5 confident strides. Izuku envied his genetics. When they were only a few feet apart, he smiled up at him. "Hi." Hisashi smiled back, somehow looking like the late Midoriya Hisashi and the Kamino supervillain all at once. "Aizu," he said brightly, "you've grown." "Tends to happen," Izuku quipped, and Aizawa stifled a surprised snort at the sass. He shuffled his backpack straps on his shoulders, embarrassed. "It's good to see you again, Dad. Mom was really happy on the phone when she called." "She's not alone in that," All for One agreed. He turned to Aizawa and Nedzu. "Do I need to fill out any paperwork before we leave? I don't mean to rush, but I have groceries in the car." "You're all set." Principal Nedzu chirped. "Our security system has already added you to the database." Given recent circumstances, however, Aizawa cut in, sending the principal an exasperated look. I would appreciate if you left a secondary contact number besides the household phone, so it can be routed appropriately if you call the school for an emergency. There is a possibility that one or more of the villains broken out of Tartarus will look for Midoriya, given his involvement in their arrests. Of course. And the villain rattled off a different number than the one in Izuku's contacts. Good thing, because as Izuku was realizing while looking at it on his phone, his personal number was about as subtle as a sledgehammer to the face. 477, seriously. It was only as they were leaving, Izuku closing the passenger side door behind him, that he realized he might have downplayed his reaction too much. If it were his mom visiting, he'd have hugged her, but could he really have been expected to hug all for one? He glanced over at the supervillain in question, who was humming a tune and tapping on the steering wheel while he drove. Was that the All Might theme song? In doing so, he became aware of the presence of several grocery bags in the back seat. Oh, so that wasn't just an excuse to hurry things up. Izuku muttered aloud. All for one chuckled. The best lies are always based in truth. Oh, Izuku knew that all too well. The first thing Izuku did as the car pulled away from UA's gates was smile nervously at All for One. Or rather, the first thing he did was stuff his phone and his wallet in the glove box, which closed with a satisfying metal thunk. It wasn't nearly thick enough to block the tracking chips and everything, but it would be more than enough to muffle the sounds of their conversation if his phone got tapped. He'd considered disabling all the tracking devices properly, but discarded the idea almost immediately. UA's security system would ping if he went dark, which would raise unnecessary suspicion. That settled. The third thing Izuku did was relax back into the passenger seat. They had at least a 20-minute drive ahead of them. It was more than enough time for him to ask all the questions brimming in his head. For at least a few minutes, he could lapse into companionable silence over the sounds of the road and the faint, familiar strains of classical music All for One had playing on the stereo. Izuku's eyes blinked open. Is this Holst's The Planet Suite? The supervillain hummed in affirmative. Yes, the first piece. You have a good ear. He seemed almost impressed. Izuku's situation after Hisashi left had improved in some ways, but not others. The food money Inko left for him was no longer being funneled into the local bars, but he still had more free time than he knew what to do with. Music lessons at the local library had filled some of the gap. Music, or classical music at least, was one of the few places left unaffected by the rise of quirks. Sciences had been defunded, medicine had been reformed, even food had changed, but a quirkless musician held no disadvantage save an untrained ear, and that was something he could change. The elderly folks attending the student piano recitals applauded his efforts the same as the quirked children after him. Thank you, Izuku started to reply, but stumbled over what name to use. Did the supervillain prefer All for One when there was nobody to overhear them, or the Hisashi alias, or some form of dad dash? Hisashi is fine, said Hisashi. I took a liking to it over the years. The alternate reading rather suits me, don't you think? A long time ago was pretty ironic. I won't demand to be called Dad. An absent father has hardly earned it. Whatever you are comfortable with using will work. Fair enough. But Izuku had other, more pertinent questions. Such as, how did you win Mom over so easily anyway? Her former husband looked nothing like you. Was it a quirk? An old quirk of mine, from back in the day. Hisashi smiled wistfully. Called it replace. I liberated it from a serial killer about 100 years ago. They were wasting it, if you ask me. Fraud would have been their calling. Izuku considered that. Villains' quirks weren't documented as thoroughly that far back in history, and then only if they were arrested. Most of his studies and analyses over the years had been about heroes for a reason. And the name All for One had given it might not have been what the original user called it either, so all he had to go on here was the name and that offhand comment about it being suited for fraud. Was it perhaps a mental quirk, a passive illusion? A long-lasting one. If it worked this far into the future, it could even be permanent given the nature of quirks at that time. The activation method could be anything. He'd had access to Hisashi for days, both alive and dead, unless the death was the activation condition, which while that would be such a specific quirk. How did stuff that's specific evolve dash? Oh, I can answer that, Hisashi interrupted Izuku's mutter storm, grinning widely. Or at least provide as close an answer as anyone's ever gotten, seeing as human experimentation was banned across the world after the emergence of quirks. Not that that would have stopped anyone, normally, he murmured, except that vigilantes enforced that law where the governments didn't, and ultimately there have always been more ethical scientists than unethical ones. The car turned off the shorter route home, in favor of the scenic route, which would give them an extra 10 minutes for this explanation. You've surely wondered, after all you've read, about the sheer variety of so-called villainous quirks. Izuku nodded. Not to say that there isn't a variety of quirks across the board, of course, but new powers nowadays certainly trend toward inheritance from the parents and have more harmless effects until trained otherwise. This was all true to Izuku's observations. He could think of several quirks in Class 1A alone that wouldn't have been destructive on their own. It was how they were applied, in tandem with martial arts and strategy, that made them useful, which only lent more weight to the idea of a quirkless hero, in his opinion. Many villains' quirks, in comparison, Hisashi went on, can't be called inherited at all. They are expressed later than most, in part because their activation conditions can't be predicted from their parents, and are, by and large, stronger and more versatile in their untrained state than their peers. A hero trains for growth, a villain trains to rein their power in. Izuku considered his experience with One for All. He trained for both. But he didn't dispute the claim in a general sense. While he was pondering, Hisashi turned the car down the long road that meant they were nearly at the apartment. These fall into the broad and less defined category of what we call latent quirks. Like mine, Izuku blurted out. From back then. Like yours, Hisashi agreed. Even so, the villain continued, some hypothesize that latent quirks are not like inherited quirks at all, that they occupy a place in reality closer to magic than science. The theological argument never quite fell out of fashion among quirk theorists, that latent quirks are more like a blessing, a single unformed wish granted to each soul in their time of direst need. When the time comes, it was said, the power gained corresponded to whatever they desired most. And they never found proof. Izuku had always brushed off any spiritual arguments in quirk theory. It was too easy to spiral into wild conspiracies if you didn't take things with a grain of salt. They tried to, said Hisashi with a sigh. But quirks were a highly politicized topic in the early days, and not enough people dared to admit to having one, even with anonymized data, so no attempt for large-scale comparison had enough volunteers before the studies were caught up in the experimentation ban and funding was redirected to other subjects. And of course, by now no quirkless person from those days is still alive, and nobody seems to care enough to fund a proper analysis of historical data, especially not when it would require digging up graves. So the spiritual explanation is the closest anyone ever got to a real answer. But we can see easily enough that latent quirks have become rarer with time. If both parents have a quirk, the likelihood is that the child's quirk is a mix of both of theirs. Somehow this was even more the case for both parents having latent quirks. Children with latent quirks are most often born to parents where one side of the family is fewer generations removed from quirklessness than the other. Hisashi seemed to want to add to that, but he paused, a thoughtful expression on his face. All for One and One for All were both manifestations of latent quirks, originally. My wish would have been to seize power from the strong, and his, I suppose, to give his power away. I sometimes think that if he'd wished to share it, he might have lived. There was a melancholy there that Izuku wasn't touching. It was already deeply weird to have this kind of philosophical discussion with the symbol of evil. So, after a moment of contemplation, he changed the subject. Shigaraki's quirk, decay, is latent, isn't it? Fortunately, that seemed to distract Hisashi from further reminiscing about painful things in his past. Oh yes, certainly. He was abused as you were. I imagine his wish was to make it all go away. Izuku grimaced. What a way to have that granted. But then, couldn't you have just taken it from him? At that, All for One chuckled. I did offer. But for all its inconveniences, Tamura likes the defense mechanism. Far be it from me to tell him how to cope. Isn't he your successor? Izuku thought. You could tell him to do anything. Hisashi hummed, non-committal. Izuku's face reddened at the realization he'd spoken out loud again. Sorry. Not to presume dash. Oh, it's all right, Izu. I know you meant well. They were pulling up to the house now. But there is only so much one can demand of another without becoming overbearing, and Tamura is a difficult person to shape. To be honest, Hisashi parked and reached around behind him for the grocery bags. Had things been a little different, he wouldn't be my successor at all. What? It was a few years ago, you see, he smiled, that I happened upon this particular individual, an analytical genius, a strategic mind unlike any other I had met in years, with not only the potential, but the drive for success. We met only briefly, but I kept an eye on them a while after that, longer than I might have been expected to, because I was curious to see where they went. And I must say, you continue to impress me, Akatani Mikumo. Even now, years after our deal, you've never once hinted to anyone at what you've done. A pit had formed in Izuku's stomach. What you helped me do, he corrected as levelly as he could. No, All for One said softly, eyes narrowed with cruel amusement, the delight of delivering a harsh truth. What you've done. Elsewhere, Yagi Tashinori perked up suddenly in the middle of a task force meeting. Please excuse me for a moment, he said to the others. I need to make a call. He couldn't say what it was that made him worry, all of a sudden, only that he was worrying. And when he phoned the school and asked Ned's, what do you mean his father picked him up? Young Midoriya lives with his mother. Midoriya-kun notified us of his father's arrival ahead of time, as did Mrs. Midoriya, per protocol, the principal countered. And the tracking chip in his school pass shows he is at home, Aizawa supplied, having been dragged into a conference call the moment Nedzu saw the caller ID. All Might blinked. Tracking chip. Added as a safety precaution with the reissue of IDs to Class 1A this term, Aizawa deadpanned. Problem children chips. Somehow, the retired number 1 hero was not reassured. Everything all right? Naomasa asked him when he returned to the meeting. They had made about as much progress in his absence as it had all day, which was to say, none at all. How the HPSC managed to get bogged down by bureaucracy when they were the only ones with jurisdiction on the Tartarus breakout, he had no idea. All Might gave a surreptitious shake of his head, mouthing, gotta go, while the chief of police was still talking. Gentlemen, Yagi cut in at last, over another rehash of the early morning's blame game between the Tartarus guards and the HPSC executives. I am afraid I do need to return to UA to confer on a matter related to the school's security dash. This was true enough not to ping Naomasa's lie detection. Any updates can be forwarded to my phone. Thank you for your time. It was incredibly satisfying to get to leave with just that flimsy excuse. But he had precious little time to enjoy it, when his mind was elsewhere, singularly focused on the matter of Izuku's whereabouts, and the supposed father figure who'd come to pick him up. The Midoriyas wouldn't mind if he stopped by for dinner, would they? Akatani Mikumo had met with Jiren in a black medical mask and nondescript gray and black streetwear, a tight-knit cap hiding his hair. When he stepped through Kurojiri's gate, into a meeting room prepared in one of All for One's many properties, he'd foregone the more stringent measures of hiding his identity. He was in something close to formal wear, with black curls he'd probably tried to tame, and carried an unmarked school bag. He'd clearly made an effort to dress up for the meeting, and it amused the supervillain that he'd tried as much as it flattered him. Good evening, All for One sama, the boy bowed. The anxious energy Yamakumo had exuded in front of the informant was gone. Now, stood before the most dangerous man in the underworld, he was at ease. In others, this attitude was accompanied by arrogance, by expectation. The boy expressed neither. He was simply not afraid. Akatani Mikumo, All for One greeted him at last. Come sit. Tell me about your request. Akatani sat. From his backpack, he retrieved a folder and laid it on the table. Adasi. I'd like to contract out a hit on this man. He had angled the folder just right to be in clear view of the cameras. Attentive, this one. Had he guessed at his blindness, and the quirks used to compensate? Or had he simply assumed the helmet had an inbuilt HUD connected with the cameras, as was the recent trend for support equipment. Kurogyari stepped out of a portal in the shadows to pour the tea. Yamakumo sipped quietly and waited while All for One reviewed the contents of the dossier. It was incredibly detailed. Everything about the target, from his quirk and appearance to his schedules, habits, social circles, his home address shared with a wife and son. Midoriya Izuku. Quirk, latent. All for One closed the folder. This is more than enough information for the matter to be handled as soon as tonight, he informed the boy. Have no doubt he will be dead. I need more than his death, sir, Akatani said. I need him to disappear. That could be arranged too, for a price. The supervillain traced the lines of kanji on the folder's cover, Midoriya Hisashi. But the question would remain in his mind until he asked, so he did. Why? In lieu of an explanation, Akatani shrugged off his jacket, bearing arms marred by dozens of starburst-shaped burns and scars. He noticed All for One looking and clarified, not these ones. Rather, he continued to unbutton his shirt, an oversized white garment, and stood, facing away so the cameras could see clearly as he let fall the fabric from his shoulders. It meant he did not see All for One's hands clench briefly into fists, or the way his arms twitched with the instinctive urge to reach out. For the briefest moment, the patchwork of scars, bandages, and variously healing open wounds had reminded him of someone else, and All for One could imagine too clearly the mingled stench of blood and antiseptic cream. But what had moved him? Most, what made him repress the urge to use a healing quirk, what twisted his expression where it hid beneath the mask, were the loose, clumsy bandages, rags stained and yellowed where they'd been boiled for reuse. A pragmatism you only observed when you had nothing. The way his brother once had. Even a supervillain was not made of stone. Name your price, All for One told Akatani, knowing he would accept any offer for the death of the man responsible for what he saw. His quirk, described in the dossier, Akatani listed off, pulling his shirt back on. And he turned back to the last page, where the family names were listed, pointed at Izuku's name. My own. As the three Midoriyas, from a certain point of view, bustled about the kitchen putting groceries away, Izuku was pleased to see that Hisashi wasn't taking any liberties with his mom. In fact, Inko was kind of cold to him, only natural treatment, Izuku decided, for an absent husband after this long. All for One bore it well. He acted the part of the sheepish husband, grateful not to be served divorce papers, so accurately Izuku almost wondered if it weren't an act. It was though. He knew. Hisashi let Izuku show him where all the dishes were, when they were done loading the fridge and the cabinets, and Inko started him on the unenviable task of cutting onions for dinner, sending Izuku off to his room to put his things away and rest for a bit in the living room. Which was much appreciated, because Izuku would have been completely distracted in the kitchen. He was still reeling from the truths revealed to him in the car. He'd been considered for All for One's successor? What did that even mean? Why would the supervillain even need a successor? Actually, no, that one answered itself now with what he knew about the results of that battle with All Might. Izuku had always wondered what the deal was with the helmet. But All for One didn't look injured whatsoever, now. So did he still need a successor? Using Shigaraki as a long-term distraction did make sense if he meant to operate in the shadows of the shadows, or if he was taking some time to lay low before starting a new attack on Japan in the next century. There were plenty of places overseas with the potential to be destabilized and turned into the next hive of scum and villainy. Engrossed as he was in these thoughts, Izuku didn't notice the doorbell ringing, or Hisashi offering to answer it, until a familiar voice reached his ears from the door. For once in his med life, All Might would really have appreciated his intuition being wrong. Just once. When it counted. But no. He had had the strangest suspicion that something was off about young Midoriya's father. Despite having only heard about the man secondhand, he hadn't even looked at the security footage of UA yet, and couldn't help but feel compelled to follow up on it, just in case Hisashi Midoriya was somehow connected to All for One's escape. And then who answered? The door but the man himself? Was that an All Might apron? Superhero, it said, in bold English font on a blue and red striped background. Oh God. Yagi had authorized that merch line back when he was first starting out. It was terrible. So this was it, huh? All for One was going to kill him, and the first volley of attacks had just begun with cringy merchandise. The man was meeting Yagi's eyes without a hint of fear, because he knew that Yagi knew who he was, and moreover, that there was not a DMN thing he could do about it. They remained frozen in a tableau of mutual enmity for a long minute, until a cheerful voice inquired from just behind the supervillain. "Dad? Who's here?" It couldn't be. A flash of malicious glee lit up All for One's face at the stricken expression that no doubt crossed Yagi's, but it disappeared in the next second as he turned to look at Izuku, replaced instead by an unbearable fondness. "I was just finding that out," he said. "Unless you already know him, Aizu?" Young Midoriya looked past the villain, saw Yagi and face-bombed. "Dad, that's my teacher. I know for a fact you saw the broadcast. You were overseas, not under a rock." And the boy smiled at All for One, to make it clear he was just teasing. "He's probably here from UA to check on me. I did say Aizawa-sensei was suspicious of you when we left." "Really?" Then Eraserhead's intuition was to be commended. "Oh, is that Yagi-san?" Inko called out from further inside the house. "He can join us for dinner. I have some meat that hasn't been fried dash." Normally Yagi would formulate some excuse to leave, embarrassed of his limited diet, and wary of appearing to accept any of Midoriya-san's advances given her marital status, but that was before he knew the home he would be wrecking belonged to his sworn nemesis. So instead, he smiled and called back, "That would be lovely, Inko-sen, thank you," and stepped past a shocked and offended All for One without a care for the chaos that would come. What followed was quite possibly the most dramatic, tense dinner of Izuku's life. Over a meal of naturally katsudon, the four of them tried and failed to sustain small talk about UA and neighborhood gossip. All Might was clearly struggling not to make any quips about Hisashi's identity, having no idea Izuku knew about it, and Izuku kept it that way, playing oblivious to the looks the two men were sending at each other, and the way Yagi flinched every time he called Hisashi Dad. Izuku might be doing that last bit on purpose. He might. His mom totally noticed their weird staring contest, but she seemed more entertained by the drama than anything. In fact, she eyed Yagi up more openly than she usually did when Izuku's mentor visited, in a transparent attempt to rile Hisashi up with jealousy. Which, gross, Izuku did not need to know Inko actually liked Yagi-sensei like that. If glares could do physical damage, All for One would have already finished off All Might an hour ago. Would it be worse, Izuku wondered, if he told his mentor the truth? "Oh, sensei, I'm not really All for One's son, he just thinks I could be a good successor. You know, like Shigaraki." Or was it more like, "Sorry, All Might, but I'm in on it too. I'm letting All for One replace Hisashi because he helped me cover up that I had the real one killed years ago dash." Aizu. Izuku blinked out of his imaginings, finding Hisashi smiling indulgently at him from the next chair. "You were making a weird face. Did I mess up the onions?" "Oh, sorry." Izuku let his cheeks flare. "I was thinking about something else for a minute." "What were we talking about?" "I was asking Yagi-san about your analysis work," Hisashi chuckled. "UA teaches quirk and strategic analysis in second and third year as an elective, does it not? I'd always thought you would apply for placement testing in that subject, but he says you haven't." Izuku sipped his water to give himself time to think of an answer. "Well," he started, anxiously averting his eyes to his bowl, "I wanted to prioritize my regular subjects, especially foundational heroics, since it took this long to get a handle on my quirk. Actually," he lowered his voice, verging on mumbling, "I was going to ask Sir Night Eye about the detective side of his agency, but he didn't like me very much when I started, and then there was the overhaul raid." "Is that so?" Hisashi eyed him thoughtfully. "Even though you're well ahead of your peers in all the regular subjects?" "I know you're fluent in English." He switched languages, eyes crinkling at the corners. "I could speak to the principal about giving you preferential treatment. It's the least you deserve as my son." Izuku snorted, going red again. "Dad, I'm not that good, you're embarrassing me." "On the contrary, Midoriya Shounen," All Might said brightly, "Present Mike has been suggesting you be moved up a few levels in English. If you ask to be tested, I'm sure you can go beyond." This time, Izuku's embarrassment didn't have to be feigned. He hid his face in his hands. Yagi-sensei, don't encourage him, he'll actually pester the principal. Which, funny though it might be, would probably bring about levels of chaos not yet observed by humanity. Hisashi ruffled his hair. Do whatever you want, Izu, he told him. I'll support the choice you make. Everything I do is all for you. Yagi flinched and dropped his chopsticks. Let me get a fresh set for you, Toshinori-kun, Inko said, already out of her chair. Oh, it's all right, Yagi stammered. I think that was the limits of my appetite. Thank you. Izuku saw All for One's evil grin out of the corner of his eye and pretended, dutifully, that he hadn't. With all the drama over dinner, Izuku had been waiting for All Might to make up some excuse to bring him back to the dorms, but Hisashi had clearly thrown him off enough he didn't even think of it. That might have been his plan all along. Izuku wasn't keeping track. Inko brought out dessert, a quartet of bouncy green jellos in fancy glasses which even Yagi could eat, and offered the retired hero a coffee to bring with him on his way out, and that was that. He had left. Izuku got up to use the bathroom, and while he was there, his phone buzzed with a text from Hisashi. Dad, +814547741111. Dad, 2052, meet in the park in half an hour. Dad, 2053, important quirk advice. All for One was going to help him. With One for All? I mean, he can't steal it, Izuku thought, so what do I have to lose? Izuku, 2053, understood. 15 minutes later, Inko announced she was going to bed early. The guest room is all set up for you, Hisashi dear, she said, more warmly than she'd been all day. Izuku can help you find more blankets if you need them. Thank you, Inko, Hisashi smiled back at his not-wife. Sleep well. They sat in silence in front of the TV for another 10 minutes after that, and then Hisashi stood up and headed for the door. Izuku hefted up the bag he'd prepared after their texts, and followed him. Mizudafu's streets were quietest between 9 p.m. and 1 a.m., something Izuku knew from both personal experience and a thorough analysis of publicly accessible data. He'd compared the crime statistics and hero duty schedules for his neighborhood years ago and posted them online as a subject for discussion. And it only occurred to him now that while charting out the patrol routes of local heroes based on their sightings and sharing the data online once might have been harmless, he probably oughtn't have kept updating the charts every month for the past 3 years. Because All for One had beamed at him on their way to the park and shown him the very same map overlay on his phone that Yamakumo had posted a week ago when Izuku observed the roundabout path they were taking, and praised him for the analysis. It's made everyone's lives easier, he said, meaning not only civilians, but also criminals. Would you believe Jiren was about to headhunt you for his own operation that day? A snort. I broke one of his fingers, and told him he'd keep his distance or he'd lose the rest. Izuku didn't make a face at that. He had not forgotten just who he was dealing with here. Of course, All for One took it as him being unaffected by it entirely, if the pleased look in his eyes was any indication. Their premeditated route led them to the southern end of the park by a winding footpath, the section devoid of working street lamps. Izuku was well acquainted with the place. He'd gone there with Kaken after school when they were little, slept there more than once when Hisashi locked him out of the house, later. It could well be that the supervillain had picked it for just that reason. I have a hypothesis I'd like to test about One for All, he said, when some quirk or another had made sure they were alone. Infrared vision? Izuku had always thought that was the most likely method. He'd used in Kamino, when the helmet was gone. But the quirk does change with every generation, so let's start with what you can tell me about it, in case the answer is already there. For a moment, Izuku imagined what it would be like if he hadn't met All for One prior to Kamino and received this request. What would he have done? Refused, of course, and probably fled, or tried to flee. But then, if he'd never met All for One before now, then he wouldn't be in this situation in the first place, and the current him, who shared history with the supervillain outside that multi-century quirk feud, had already trusted the king of the underworld with more and worse. So he told him everything. Months, mere months, from the bone-breaking beginnings and early attempts at compensation with shoot style, to the change in visualization that led him to full cowl, to the fight with Overhaul and Ares Rewind. Yes, I did borrow her quirk, all for one confirmed as an aside. I'd been waiting for a quirk like Rewind to appear for years. Good guess. And his most recent discovery? He called them the vestiges, traces of the previous users left alive within One for All. I activated Black Whip by accident during a training match. He said there's 6 more? But I've barely had time to investigate just that quirk, and it's agonizing when uncontrolled, so I only know about a couple of the other predecessors' abilities. He trailed off, for Hisashi had leaned back against the nearest tree, arms crossed, expression thoughtful. That is roughly in line with my expectations, he said, flickers of red static illuminating his silhouette in the dark. One for All has the unique problem of being both a 1st and 9th generation quirk in a world where naturally inherited quirks, like the ones we discussed earlier today, have only reached 5th or 6th gen. That, on top of it being latent, makes it overpowered and highly unstable, especially for this century, with few or none of the inbuilt failsafes possessed by modern quirks, or my own. He emphasized his point with an upturned palm, red glow brightening with an electric crackle before it dimmed down again. The forest ambience from moments before was displaced by an unnatural quiet. Izuku's entire being seemed to attune to the power, as if magnetized, even after it faded away. It would seem, Hisashi continued, my hypothesis is worth testing in this generation, if you would like to do so. Sure, Izuku nodded, calling on a bit of One for All and getting into a fighting stance. What do I do? No need to move, Hisashi told him. Stand, or sit if you can do that, and raise output by 2% every minute until you reach your maximum workable level. I'll gather preliminary data. That was far less painful than he'd honestly expected, especially since Izuku had been practicing calling on full cowl outside of classes for a while now, while he could only really get to about 20% in combat exercises. It was closer to 30 while standing still the way he was doing. The fine control necessary to uptick by precisely 2% every minute was a pleasant strain on his focus, like attempting a violin piece from memory, or following along with Uraraka's demonstration of Gunhead's martial arts katas. 20%, the brightening flickers of green lightning around him cast strange, sharp shadows on their surroundings. Hisashi's eyes barely registered the light. His gaze was distant, and Izuku assumed, fixed upon something other than the real. 24%, 26, 28. Izuku's eyelid twitched as he neared the borderline of what power he could draw. He turned his focus inward, on steadying his breathing, and held full cowl steady at 30, though the sensation made his hands itch. It took Hisashi a moment to catch his attention again, hand extended in the universal gesture of, turn it down. Now, the man said when he'd lowered to 8%, can you activate Black Whip? His fingers twitched, and a narrow column erupted from the earth, off to Izuku's side. Use that as a target if you need one, or can it be held onto passively the way full cowl can? Izuku pulled on the quirk, gritting his teeth at the weird sort of pain it spawned in his shoulders, and sent half of the energy tendrils to grab onto the column. It's more manageable with a target to hold, thank you for that, but I can hold it on its own if needed too. I haven't had as much time to study it, so the fine movements are iffy, but in a combat situation it still brute forces well enough to be useful. And can you layer it with full cowl? Could he? Izuku tried. He'd done it before, but not at the same power output as before, he admitted after a minute. If I raise it past 16%, the tendrils flailed uselessly before flickering out, leaving his muscles sore. Izuku muttered under his breath, rolling his shoulders. Hisashi, meanwhile, seemed very interested in the results of his mysterious observation. I see, he murmured, eyes bright. No, they were glowing actually, the same faint red of his quirk now in his irises. It really does, and the balancing. He trailed off into muttering, hand over his mouth, and the familiarity of the gesture struck Izuku after a moment's delay like a gong. I do that, he thought, not quite sure why it bothered him the way it did. My observations support the hypothesis. Hisashi spoke up at a more audible volume. Now, I think, is the time to test it. You've seen Star Wars? The original franchise? Or the dash, Izuku grimaced, quirked remake. Oh good you have taste. More to the point, I assume you've meditated before. Which wasn't a question, but in fact he had. From Star Wars, actually. Izuku had been intrigued by the concept of meditating Jedi being able to go without food and water. He'd found he still needed to eat and drink, of course, trance state or otherwise, but when he couldn't sleep for pain, or hunger, or paranoia about being caught sleeping outside by a stray hero on patrol, meditating let him ignore everything for a time. The villains sat down cross-legged on the grass, and Izuku followed suit. You surely recall the concept of the Force, Hisashi said, and Izuku nodded again. Imagine, for me, that the Force exists, that every living thing touches it, for all that it exists outside the dimensions we know. If we close our eyes, then, as you have done, we can imagine the Force as a light. And Izuku heard more, distantly, about the nature of quirks, but his attention had turned inward, so the last real thought he had was, let there be light. But imagine the Force as a light, Hisashi murmured, opening his eyes as he spoke, for he didn't need them closed to envision this. It was, if he chose to pay attention, his reality because, moreover, let us imagine that quirks come from the Force, that things with quirks glow brighter in our senses than the rest. You know from my voice that I am here in front of you. And I am full of quirks, so I must glow very brightly. Picture that light, and use it as your beacon. Just as I can use you as mine. Multiple quirk manifestation. At last. Every user of One for All glowed brighter than the one before. All for One had wondered for centuries if there was a limit to that light, because his ever rarer glimpses of the quirk holders had only shown growth. Until Aizu. Yamakumo had borne the dim glow of a powerful latent quirk when they first met, face to face. Taking that for himself had rendered him, arguably, more dangerous. A genius, a tactical prodigy, who did not shy from bloodshed if it was expedient, and now undetectable to All for One's first instinct. He had known, that very night, that if the boy were ever turned against him, by a Yakuza with a grudge, by the HPSC, by a foreign government with the resources to train an assassin, he would very likely achieve what the 8 holders of his brother's quirk hadn't. And that simply couldn't be allowed to happen. How convenient was it, then, that it didn't? All Might had met Izuku Midoriya, the quirkless civilian, and given him One for All. When he'd realized what had happened, watching the sports festival, he'd damaged his respirator from laughing so hard. Then Kamino. There had been no pretext for capturing Aizu over the summer break that would keep Tamura from being curious. Aizu had already drawn his attention enough that he stalked him to the mall for a confrontation. All for One had let Tamura kidnap a student of his choice, and tried not to be disappointed when he picked the flashy, explosive boy. Perhaps we will catch him on a rescue mission, then, he'd hoped, eager to see his iteration of the quirk. Instead, he'd managed a few glances in Aizu's direction, with little time to think about it. Oh, but what he'd seen. One for All was subdued in Aizu in a way that even the original stockpiling quirk hadn't been. In prison, between bouts of heavy sedation, he'd wondered about it, forming and discarding hypotheses with what indirect data he could glean from both his memory and the ongoing feedback from the search quirk he'd taken off that rescue hero. It had been slow going, like deriving equations from first principles, until one idea came to him that fit. Then it was only a matter of waiting. Breaking out of Tartarus, with his pick of the quirks within, was easy now. His incentive was there. Restoring himself with young Ares rewind? Child's play. Not literally, he'd borrowed the quirk, rather than let her rewind him, and given it back after. And in the heat of the moment, on the high of his triumph, back to his full power, he'd forsaken the League, no doubt waiting for him somewhere. They would keep. He'd gone to Aizu. He wanted to know. Let there be light. Izuku was in the place of mist again, surrounded by the colorful lights of the vestiges. It was not as peaceful as the last time. What the F dash? Fifth was shouting, squirming in the grasp of fourth and second. What is going on? You know him? Oh dear. Give him a second, Banjo. Nana rolled her eyes. He just got here. He'll explain. Izuku opened his mouth to do just that, but words weren't coming out yet. He scrubbed a hand down his face, frustrated. So is the big bad really your dad? A yellow light third leaned in conspiratorially. You didn't really act like it when it was just you two, but if it's a strained family situation from being on opposite sides of the law, you're hardly the first one. First. Well, Izuku choked out through the dissipating mist on his face. He coughed again, at last clearing his throat. I'm pretty sure our only genetic relation is because of one for all. But we have some similar habits that kind of surprised me. Like the muttering. Izuku had thought he was the only one who did that. You do have remarkably similar personalities at times, said another voice. You and my brother even look a lot alike. That's not a disguise quirk? Izuku squeaked. That's just his face? First chuckled at his shock, but then turned more serious. Ninth, he addressed him directly, you've met my brother before. Some of us have already chosen to ignore that, because you have a hero's heart, but what exactly did you do? To have him treat you this well? Izuku winced. He'd never told anyone about the specifics of that time, for a reason. But the vestiges would have to know, eventually, wouldn't they? So he braced himself, and opened his mouth to tell the tale. There came a low rumbling like distant thunder, and the holders turned as one in the direction of a door that had appeared behind them, or perhaps it had always been there. Fifth swore, sending Black Whip out to push against it, and fourth and second joined him, throwing their full body weights against it. There was fear on Nana's face and dawning anger on First's, but for all their effort, the knob was turning, the door was opening, to admit a looming, black shape, limbed in red. You BC, Nana hissed, stepping in front of Izuku to hide him. You're not welcome here. Get out. We'll fight you again if we have to, someone shouted, to general agreement, and the room began to light up with a rainbow of lightning static. But the shadow ignored them. Its glowing red eyes stared straight ahead at Izuku's. Akatani Mikumo. It greeted him, downright warm. It is a pleasure to meet you again. A broad hand extended in his direction, but didn't cross the threshold, held at bay by the vestige's power. Izuku stepped forward, toward the door. The vestiges grabbed at him to pull him back, cries of alarm and anger filling his ears, but they were mere shadow and vapor, lights in the mist. They could not truly stop him either, as he smiled at the shadow and stepped outside. The pleasure, he returned, reaching out for the offered hand, is all mine dash. When the moment came, it was undramatic, Hisashi decided. There should have been more of a sign, right? A flare of light, a blast of air, a cold wind, a crash of thunder, an eldritch resonant ringing from all directions heralding the end of the world. Something. But then his Aizu always was the expedient type. So Hisashi, with his quirk sense, was the only witness to the arrival of singularity. One for all meet. All for one. Izuku woke up at home. He blinked open bleary eyes and instinctively reached for his phone on the nightstand to check the lock screen. 3 a.m. So he'd been asleep for, somewhere around 5 hours, if he counted it from when he'd gone into the vestiges realm during meditation. Oh, and he was in his bed. At home. Which meant All for One had brought him home, and he actually hoped he'd used a quirk to warp them here, as the alternative of being carried was super embarrassing. He sat up properly, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and was surprised to find that he wasn't tired. Even though 5 hours was normally little better for him than a nap. He felt rested. And then he went to wring out the usual soreness in his hands, and realized. His hands didn't hurt. It wasn't just his hands. His arms didn't hurt. His shoulders didn't. The old, ill-healed scars on his back weren't itching the way they always did until he applied skin oil. His knees and ankles weren't stiff and vaguely sore the way they'd been since he started training shoot style. Even his head didn't ache. This was probably a quirk. Unless All for One had dosed him with some really good painkillers he'd had his scientists develop, plausible? Or he was dreaming really vividly, slightly less plausible. But a quirk was much more likely, so all he needed to do now was find out what. He climbed out of bed, astonished by how easy it was. He didn't even have to brace himself for the dull ache when his knees started carrying his weight. Yeah, this had to be a quirk. No painkillers worked this well. He reached over to flick on the lamp on his bedside table and his fingers weren't crooked anymore. The ugly warp to the small bones, the scars from the breaks, they were all gone. What? Izuku whispered, taken aback. How? How much had he given up, believing it would be forever? The piano, the violin, things he'd grieved for losing and told himself he'd moved on from, just as he'd told himself the change didn't bother him. But oh, it had, and now that pain, too, was gone. Izuku swallowed, throat tight with emotion. He found his eyes watering even before he dared to look in the mirror. But when he did, at last, shedding the loose pajamas he'd woken up in, twisting around so he could see, it wasn't just his hands. All of his scars were gone. Every silvery scratch, every shiny pink starburst, every ill-healed burn that had once littered his back from shoulder to shoulder, the lot of it, replaced by flawless, lightly freckled skin. That he had freckles. Izuku was going to cry. Despite the hour, the smell of coffee brewing wafted under Izuku's door as he continued to marvel at his newfound well-being. Drawn out by his appetite, he put the pajamas back on, and didn't fumble with the buttons, like he would have, and didn't feel the fabric catch on uneven scars on his back, because there weren't any. When he at last padded out into the kitchen, following the scent and a vague sense of all-for-one's presence in the house, Izuku had managed to get a hold of all the emotions he was feeling about this new state of being, at least enough to have a necessary conversation. "Aizu," Hisashi greeted, holding out a steaming mug in the hand not holding his own. "Good morning." Izuku took the coffee. Sipped it. It was the same brand he liked. They hadn't had it in the house yesterday. Held up his free hand. "A quirk did this." Red eyes glittered. "Several." He paused, surprised that the man had simply admitted it. "That I'm not complaining," he clarified after a moment. Was it overhaul? Pleased surprise on Hisashi's face. Now, it was so weird knowing it was naturally similar to his own. "I did acquire his ability before I left Tartarus, yes." That wasn't an answer. But Izuku had long hypothesized all for one could pick and choose different pieces of a quirk to express, like copy-pasting code, and combine them into something new if he so chose. Molecular-level reconstructive healing, he guessed, since disintegrating and reforming with his quirk would just render the target the same as before without skilled application. But how did you direct it to erase the scars? They healed years ago. And what was the energy source? Hisashi hesitated. Squinted at Izuku's still outstretched hand. "Huh," he said. "I didn't expect that, actually. The quirk I gave you was meant to be minor healing at best. One for all." "Hold up. The quirk you gave me? Not used on me?" Izuku downed the rest of his coffee and set the mug down, the better to glare at the man. He wasn't really angry though, and they both knew it when he added quieter, "Do I really have?" "You may recall," Hisashi leaned back against the counter, "the story of how One for All came about. How I gave my brother a stockpiling quirk, and his latent quirk let him pass his power on." Izuku nodded. That power was not only pure energy. One for All stockpiles the quirk present in its host when it is passed on. Or more accurately, a copy. "A copy of every quirk present," Izuku repeated. "And it passed through you." Hisashi watched the realization dawn, watched him freeze, wide-eyed, and slowly, subconsciously, bring his hand up to cover his mouth, before he noticed it and put it back down. Did the quirks within All for One also get copied by One for All? Why don't you find out for yourself? All for One had not lied to Izuku in saying he'd considered him for a successor. He had, however, left out just how often he'd considered it. Every time, in the years between then and now, that he'd seen Tamura, he had imagined Yamakumo in his place. Had mentally exchanged Tamura's careless mess of sweatshirts with Mikumo's low-budget best, had grimaced at Tamura's messy, disorganized mission reports and recalled the neat, detailed dossier on Midoriya Hisashi, had watched every time Tamura failed and thought wistfully of how Mikumo wouldn't. Had reminded himself, time and again, that to compare them was unfair, because he had had to shape Shigaraki Tamura from the clay that was Shimura Tenko, but Akatani Mikumo had formed himself from Midoriya Izuku all on his own. They were at different stages of development, in more ways than one. He could not judge Tamura by Mikumo's standards. But his injuries had limited All for One's patience, and Tamura was so slow. So, complacent, in his environment, and incurious. He had yet to grasp nuance. He was blinded by faith in his superior and desperate for recognition. Cultivating him into a functional human being was hard enough, a functional heir to his empire. After a while, All for One had considered just giving up. Watching Izuku turn all his mental focus on his newly awakened quirk, then, was refreshing. He could almost see the genius intellect at work in the tiny shifts of expression across the boy's face, the twitch of his faint frown, the crease in his brow, and how in mere moments his entire face was lighting up, eyes opening, as he understood the situation and realized. "This is so cool," Izuku breathed. To us. Really was. He could, in a sense, look inward and catalog what quirks were in his possession, and focus on them individually to perceive how they worked. It wasn't quite a visualization, though he could probably try a mind palace technique if he meditated. He just knew. And if he really looked, he could see the seams where the quirks could be separated further, into their components, just like he'd once guessed All for One could, though he also saw, just as intuitively, that if he started fiddling with the components he would exhaust himself immediately. He needed more sleep before getting into that. "You've answered your own questions about the properties of this quirk, then?" Hisashi smiled. "Since I seem to recall a young boy talking a mile a minute about the possibilities of optimization for recombinant quirks." Izuku finished his coffee, and Hisashi poured him another one. By the time he'd finished it, stifling a yawn despite the caffeine, several things had become clear that he hadn't quite realized upon waking up earlier. All for One, the quirk, was a little like One for All, in how it leapt eagerly to his fingertips with the barest thought. He'd have to practice using the new quirks in his collection before he could do more than just the give and take of it, but it felt very intuitive. On the other hand, while One for All as an enhancer could be activated in a limited fashion, All for One was on-off. And the passive elements of the quirk didn't turn off at all. That whole force analogy is really on the nose, isn't it? Izuku muttered into his third mug of coffee. He was beginning to suspect Hisashi was giving him decaf. He squinted up at the man, resisting the urge to shield his face from what his brain was trying to perceive as a bright not-quite light contained within Hisashi's body. "I'd ask if you were using this earlier too, but you're always using it. You'll be able to tune it out soon enough," All for One promised, reaching for the coffee pot to top off their mugs with the last dregs. "On the flip side, you can lean into it when you can't use your regular eyes. Between that and the infrared vision, I got along pretty well without natural sight on a day-to-day basis." "Didn't you also have a quirk to interface with cameras?" Hisashi blinked. "That too." He seemed on the verge of saying something else, faltered, and then rallied. "Speaking of useful quirks, I should tell you this now rather than later dash." After the anticlimactic singularity, Izu's consciousness visibly fell out of meditation and into true sleep. Hisashi double-checked their surroundings for any observers, found none, and snuck closer to his would-be successor, laying a hand on Izu's forehead. Good he wasn't feverish. Hisashi had worried he might be, considering how he'd experienced the awakening of the original quirk from its latent state. If he sent him back to UA ill, or kept him home for a day, while he recuperated, then Yagi and his circle of confidants would immediately assume he'd used a quirk on Izu, which technically he had. But then, All for One wasn't Izu's latent quirk. Hisashi grinned, remembering how useful that one had been in the past couple of years. He brushed a stray lock of vivid green off Izu's forehead, calling the quirk in question to the forefront of his attention. And, see, he couldn't be blamed for what happened next, because there'd never been two users of All for One before. How was he to know that the copy lurking under Izu's skin would latch onto his once quirk and pull it back from him? Moreover, when Hisashi reached out and tried to get it back again, how was he to predict that a copy would stay behind? He lurched back, hands over his mouth to stifle the hysterical giggle threatening to break free. "Oh no!" "It what?" Izuku set his empty mug down before he squeezed it too hard and shattered it. "Actually no, what if I give it back?" He held out his hand for Hisashi to take, mentally focusing in on the one quirk that he just knew hadn't been in the collection of All for One or stockpiled in One for All, and pushed it back. He did not even look closely at it. The quirk belonged to Hisashi, per the terms of their old agreement, and that was all Izuku wanted to know. Hisashi stared at his hand. Now I have 2. He grabbed Izuku's wrist. Here, take it back again dash. Another transfer, a pull by Izuku's copy of All for One. Izuku's eyes widened. Now I have 2. I kind of hate this. All for One stared into the distance. Infinite duplication has no business being this easy. Shigaraki would call it hacks. Izuku fought a giggle. Okay, maybe there was caffeine in the coffee. Then, oh, Kami Shigaraki. I could copy his quirk. Do you want it? Hisashi straightened. I can bring him right here dash. In a narrowly avoided parallel universe, Shigaraki Tamura felt Sensei's warp ability activated and shouted in triumph. Then he shouted in terror, at the 2 near-identical expressions turned his way, and the hand that splayed over his face before he could react, tearing his quirk from him. Tamura had been made quirkless before as punishment for significant mistakes. He hated it, but he also feared it, and so he couldn't be blamed for being in shock as Sensei, restored to a face he only vaguely remembered, muttered up a storm with some green-haired brat that looked a lot like him. Wait, did he know him? And poked the boy on the forehead, before reaching out to give decay back, less than a minute later. Any solid object. Sensei leaned back against the kitchen counter, they were in an apartment, with his arms crossed, attention on his green doppelganger, who was picking up an empty mug beside him and decaying it. What the F dash dot? Sensei's head whipped around. Tamura, language. I think I'm past the impressionable youth stage, Dad, the boy smirked, rolling his eyes. The boy was retrieving a potato from the open sack on the countertop, careful to use just 3 fingers, and then deliberately laid all 5 on it, staring at the root vegetable with a very intense, studying sharpness to his eyes as it crumbled into dust. I can't believe you thought this was villainous, the boy exclaimed, turning to fix Tamura with the same look he'd just given the potato, and oh hell no, he recognized that face and voice now. There was no effing way. You can even separate by composition. Green eyes gleamed with manic fascination as the second potato began to decay, but only the outer skin. How the F are you doing that? How have you never tried? Midoriya Izuku shot back, grabbing the potato sack and tossing 2 of them into Tamura's lap before plucking out the last one and decaying the bag. The different materials feel different. You could probably decay liquids or even gases with practice, and there's got to be something really interesting happening chemically here if I had a microscope and a couple of analysis tools dash. Forgive him, Yamakumo, Sensei chided gently. Tamura, like many, isn't that deeply interested in quirk analysis. Ugh, but not even his own quirk? Midoriya griped, now attempting to decay the air if his look of concentration were any indicator. This isn't rocket science, anyone should be able to figure it out dash. Not so, Sensei, smiling, disagreed. You are not just anyone, Aizu. You're quite special. Suddenly it all clicked. The name, Yamakumo, that was the guy Sensei kept comparing Tamura to, under his breath, whenever he disappointed him. Tamura had thought it was some colloquialism. After a while, a strawman example for him to live up to. Nobody was that perfect. Except he was real, and he was the hero brat that had thwarted all of Sensei's work and defeated Overhaul. And called Sensei, Dad, just now, didn't he? This is getting out of hand, Tamura thought, frightened. Now there's 2 of them. You're OP, he told Yamakumo firmly. This is outrageous. It's unfair. Fortunately, however, none of that happened, because Izuku was a little bit more sensible and turned the offer down. I want to save it for when I threaten him someday, he declared, and wow, that had come out a bit wrong. Just a little terrorizing. Teasing, was that coffee decaf? The first mug was half CAF, the rest decaf, Hisashi confessed breezily. We've covered the important things, so let's go back to bed and regroup in the morning. Izuku was not looking forward to the vestiges appearing in his next dream, but it was just short of 4 a.m. at the moment. So, fair enough, he said and went back to bed. When he woke up at a normal hour, later, it was to the sounds of breakfast and the 9 o'clock news. Morning Mom, morning Dad, Izuku called out as he opened his door, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Do I smell coffee dash? Then he froze, because his parents weren't the only people in the house. Oh. Aizawa-sensei, Detective Tsukachi, hi good morning, I'll just go change dash out of his Eraserhead print pajamas and all-might slippers, and into something less transcendentally embarrassing. Aizawa's ears were red at the ends where they stuck out from under his mop of hair. You do that, problem child, he hand-waved, staring down into his mug as he sipped it with the general vibe of someone who wished it were alcohol instead. You do that. Don't let Dad trick you with the decaf, Izuku hurriedly advised as he backed up and closed the door. Once alone, it was time to panic. Do I just get dressed, or should I just wear other PJs in case we need to buy time? Is this a home visit or an extraction or both? Does the detective know what he's looking for dash? His phone, currently on silent, lit up with a text notification. Dad, 9:12. I have been caught with the decaf. Aizawa says he should arrest me for war crimes. Dad, 9:13. The regular coffee is brewing. I will try and save you a cup. Nothing about the messages gave any indication as to the urgency of the situation at a surface level, but if the underground hero and police detective were staying for coffee, then he probably had time. Izuku decided he'd just wear whatever was in the room. He'd brought all his hero merch to UA for reasons even he couldn't remember, but he probably still had an outfit or two left behind. When he emerged a second time, it was in a set of utterly nondescript black clothes that Izuku had honestly forgotten he owned. There was something about them that he should remember, but for the life of him, uncaffeinated Izuku could not say what. He could tell by the guests' expressions, though, that he'd surprised them with his wardrobe choice. Maybe the t-shirt with sleepwear written on it would have gone over better, he thought, aligning with their expectations of me. But too late for that bit. Coffee, Izuku requested flatly of Hisashi, who passed him the reserved mug with great amusement but little fanfare. He proceeded to chug half the contents before he realized it was oversweetened, grimace, and power through the rest of it with a repressed shudder. Ugh, that's vile. You asked for it, Aizawa observed. Kaken is the one who adds all the frilly sugar things into his coffees, Izuku protested. No one ever believes that I drink mine black. Hisashi blinked innocently at him. Oh, I must have given you my mug. Forgive me, Aizu, they're the same color. He passed him the correct coffee, which after a tentative sip, Izuku gratefully depleted, washing away the dreadful taste in his mouth. His replenished brain had a thought. Neither of those was yours, was it? You have a third on the counter behind you. Their guests, and Izuku's mom, looked between him and Hisashi like they were watching a TV drama. And, sure enough, a grand deduction and an accurate one, grinned Hisashi, pulling his mug red, how fitting from where he'd hidden it behind his back and taking a long sip. Also the pot is empty now, so I'll make more. With that, he turned around to set up another brew, and conveniently gave Izuku an in on the conversation that had been happening while he was absent. Good morning, he repeated, starting over now he was a functional being again. And, since bluntness was what was expected of him, did something happen? Netsu's tightened security overnight, Aizawa answered just as bluntly. There's a lead on the Tartarus breakout. All students and staff are being recalled to campus. Well, shit. Izuku opened his mouth to ask another question. And their families, yes? Inko interrupted. Faced with confusion, she elaborated, Izuku was present for the apprehension of that villain, and from the explanations given to the public, All for One is not above using family members for reprisal. And he is, Izuku thought, from a certain point of view. He was having a pretty good time of it, though. Inko, honey, Hisashi spoke up, I'm sure we could shelter in a hero agency like other families are doing dash. Like the Bakugas, Izuku supplied. They'd have to be evacuated too, wouldn't they? Or have a protection detail. His mom glared daggers at Hisashi's back. Not literally, though that would be an interesting quirk, wouldn't it? How about we let the official law enforcement personnel provide an answer? She suggested, just as sharply. Detective Tsukachi blinked at the sudden hostility between Izuku's parents. Izuku sipped the dregs of his coffee and pretended not to notice, and Aizawa at least seemed to take that as a cue to do the same. Actually, we have been sent to escort you all to UA, the officer admitted. Most families of 1A students have been assigned hero protection, including the Bakugas, but given young Midoriya's, unique situation, Principal Nedzu has advocated for sanctuary on campus, yes. Can we refuse? Inko asked bluntly. Well, Tsukachi started. And Aizawa finished, no. This prompted a quiet argument between the two representatives. Well, technically, and there is no technicality in the law and it's part of the student safety contract, Naomasa, Nedzu covers all his bases, you know this. Izuku accepted an inadvisable third mug of coffee from All for One, who was clearly immensely entertained, and drank half of it at a sedate pace before the detective finally sagged in defeat and clarified that no, you can't refuse. Fine then, Inko huffed, but where are we meant to be staying and for how long? With any luck, Midoriya-san, it will be less than a week, the detective offered as consolation. As for location, Aizawa checked his phone. In 3 hours, your guest apartment will be finished being added onto the dorms. So there's time for breakfast, then, Hisashi said brightly, and started making pancakes. Shoyuta was beyond certain there was something wrong with Midoriya Hisashi. Ended up spending so much time there the customers thought I was one of the fry cooks off-shift dash. Not that it was that weird for a man who spent most of his time in America to be this good at making American-style breakfasts, though the cutesy geometric shapes he managed to draw with the batter were a bit fancier than strictly necessary. And one even thought I was the manager, and came to me to complain dash. He'd have liked to say it was that the man was too sunshine-y and friendly for the early hour, but it was almost 10 for 1 and 2, Problem Child was right there, listening to his father's storytelling with bright eyes. So I played along. The waitress even pretended to cry when I told her she was fired. Hisashi plated the last pancake and turned off the stove. Left her $100 tip and saved the BSDRD's license plate to anonymously report as stolen a day later. Shoyuta related to that pettiness on a spiritual level. Dad, no you didn't. Problem Child had his face in his hands, giggling. Was that his 4th cup of coffee? Shoyuta subtly nudged a glass of water in his direction and hoped for the best. I absolutely did. The alternative would be egging the car, but then they'd know I did it. Hisashi smirked, reaching for the syrup bottle, and surreptitiously replaced Problem Child's coffee mug with another, identical-looking one while the kid's attention was elsewhere. Shoyuta admired the sleight of hand. If he hadn't been eyeing the mug, even he wouldn't have noticed. Anyway, it was obvious enough why Midoriya Inko hadn't protested her husband's absence from their son's life for however long it had been. Shoyuta could recognize a flawed man when he saw one, and Hisashi's particular brand of unethical pettiness and disregard for authority was not a great foundation for a pro-hero in the modern day. It was hard enough to rein in Problem Child's irresponsible pursuit of justice as it was now, in a world where his father had had more influence over him. Shoyuta repressed a shiver. It still begged the question, however, of why All Might was so suspicious of the man that he had sent his pet detective in his stead. Shoyuta could tell from Naomasa's attentiveness to the situation that he had his quirk activated, but no idea what he was looking for. Much as he wanted to believe this was merely the former number 1 hero being overprotective of his favorite student, or insecure about his place as the boy's father figure, it wasn't enough of an explanation to quell Shuta's worries, not when the Tartarus breakout had just happened. Was that what it was? Did Yagi suspect a connection between Midoriya Hisashi and All for One? Shoyuta palmed the eye drops in his pocket, considering. There were possibilities. Hisashi could be an agent of the symbol of evil, sent to monitor the Midoriya household under deep cover. He could be an agent, or even an entirely unrelated criminal, coming out of the woodwork to see his family for the short interval while the authorities were preoccupied with the big bad. He could really, truly be a civilian with no idea of the ridiculous timing of his return, simply enjoying time with his wife and kid, and totally unaware of the danger they were all in. Or, some small part of Shuta's mind suggested, he could be someone far more dangerous than I would ever know. A bit hard to believe that last bit when the man had a droplet of syrup clinging to the end of his nose, though. Idea, Izuku blurted out. If we're going back to campus, we should bring a bunch of snacks. Problem Child dash. And it's Saturday, which means the merch bundle I pre-ordered last week is now in stock. Midoriyakuen dash. And while we're out I could really use a new pair of shoes, these ones are falling apart dash. Inko sighed, clearly used to these antics. Yes, Izuku, we can go to the mall, she said, before either of their guests could try and convince her otherwise. Yes. In Naomesa's opinion, going out in public when Japan's most infamous supervillain could be after you was a terrible idea. Unfortunately, neither he nor Aizawa were able to convince Midoriya Inko that this was the case, as she brought up the very salient point that, if All for One showed up to cause trouble, you would not be able to do any more against him here, in this house, than you could in the mall. Aizawa looked like he was considering arguing the point, or pressing matters and confining them to the house until the safe house in UA was finished, but quailed under Midoriya-san's sharp glare. 10 minutes later, they were all fastening their seatbelts in Midoriya Hisashi's armored car for the short drive to the mall, an arrangement that saw Naomesa in the front passenger's seat. Like most such specialized vehicles, the car had a small noise-canceling barrier between the front seats and the back, the sort of thing that was useful when one had a chauffeur, which muted whatever was being said by the three passengers in the back, and left Naomesa as Hisashi's only immediate victim. Okay, that was a bit of an exaggeration. Midoriya Hisashi was a perfectly nice person. It was Naomesa who had stumbled into a very touchy subject with all the finesse of a three-legged elephant. They had been talking about Izuku, of course. Aizu is my pride and joy, has been from the beginning, true. Hisashi smiled faintly, eyes on the road, half distracted by navigating. He simply talked, and Naomesa listened. A sigh. I left them be so he'd have room to grow, but sometimes wish I hadn't, you know? True. Naomesa nodded noncommittally. It's not my place to say whether Inko deserves to have him, but... He trailed off, and Naomesa had to wonder. Was your separation from Inko Midoriya not amicable? HM? Oh no, nothing like that, we're not divorced. True, my career simply takes me away for years at a time. True, I would have had to hire caregivers for Izuku if he'd come along with me. He wouldn't have seen me any more for being on the same continent. True. May I ask after your profession? It's never been mentioned, Naomesa said. It had surprised him, actually, just a bit. Most businessmen love to talk about work as if it was their only hobby. At least Hisashi didn't seem bothered by the question. International executive, he replied. You're probably acquainted with a lot of the companies under my umbrella. Wink. True. But it's more consultation and freelance management than any real oversight, so I wouldn't say I really make all that much. False. But it was a lie Naomesa was used to hearing. No one with money liked to admit it, and many simply didn't. That Hisashi had spoken of it at all meant he took some measure of pride in it, so he wasn't born into money, the way a lot of people were. He'd had nothing once, he knew the value of what he earned. It wasn't worth questioning further, Naomesa realized, because there was something else missing from his mental profile of Midoriya Hisashi that was much more important. Izuku hasn't mentioned your quirk. And that was odd, for the boy. He usually went on and on about quirks the moment they came up in conversation, the few times Naomesa had met him so far. Are you quirkless? Hisashi chuckled. Oh, certainly not. True. But I've never seen the need to parade it around the way so many people do nowadays. Fire breath is not at all convenient when my suits are both expensive and flammable. True. You could get fire-resistant suits, Naomesa pointed out, and received an odd look, a faint grimace at the corners of Hisashi's mouth, and the impression he'd misstepped in this conversation. I think it's telling, Hisashi began, that your immediate response upon hearing I don't use my quirk that often is to imply I should be changing my whole life around that quirk, instead of simply controlling myself like any person with the ability to turn their quirk off ought to. Especially in a country where public quirk use is still supposed to be illegal. It wasn't a true-false type of statement, so Naomesa's lie detection quirk didn't activate. And maybe it's just that I've been away for so long, the man went on, but it feels very impolite to ask someone about their quirk at all. What if someone doesn't have a quirk? Well, nowadays, Naomesa started to say. Hisashi frowned, slightly. It was the first time Naomasa had seen that expression on his face since meeting him, and unease shivered down his spine. Izuku was quirkless, he reminded him, and the temperature of the space seemed to drop a degree. How do you think he felt when people asked what his ability was? Silence weighed heavy on the conversation. For years, Izu was discounted as weak, as useless, by not only his peers, but the adults too. I still have no idea why he decided to let Deku be his hero name. False, he did know, considering who gave it to him and what they meant. They'd reached the parking lot for the mall by this point. Hisashi parked rather far down the rows, under a bit of shade from an overhang, and fixed Naomasa with a fierce look that had his instincts screaming at him to run. The way he'd felt when he watched the video feed of Kamino. Izu could have stayed quirkless, and I would be just as proud of him. True. He was always a genius. If you ask me, he doesn't need one for all. With that, he got out of the car, leaving Naomasa reeling for a moment as his brain caught up. Tashinori, he messaged All Might with shaking hands, what is going on here? Being that it was 10 a.m. on a Saturday, the Kiyoshi shopping center was busy. Nothing, not even the knowledge of villains roaming the country, was going to dissuade people nowadays. Hisashi surprised Izuku by approving of it. People aren't made to live in fear. No one is cowed by power in the long term, the will of the masses is moved most of all by ease. Izuku shrugged. Ironic though, isn't it? The center of danger is here. All for one grinned. We are, aren't we? The danger is still present, in your time, as it was in ours. They were, after all, using the excuse of Izuku dragging Hisashi by the wrist toward the hero merch store to maintain the skin contact needed for a continuous abuse of the quirk copying mechanism they discovered. Already, after a few minutes, they'd pared down the time needed for their hack to just 5 seconds, and Izuku could sense his library of quirks being stocked with all of the most useful things Hisashi had taken, edited or invented, for him to experiment with later. Niche, specific and interesting powers, like telepathy and infrared vision, and that wicked Warpingu quirk that Izuku had seen the man use in Kamino to summon the League. He'd taken that one wholesale from its previous holder. For whatever reason, warp quirks are the hardest to modify. I had to wait years before the original user was willing to sell it to me. What about Kurogyri? Warpgate is actually 3 quirks working in a weird combination. I wish I could fit them all together into just one. When they got to the shop in question, though, it had a big sign on the front window that read, opening at 11 o'clock, and a just-forming line of customers waiting to pick up their pre-orders. Oh hell no, Hisashi muttered under his breath. Right, I forgot about that. Don't worry, we're not waiting in line, Izuku assured him with a winning smile. Let's find something else to do in the meantime. Hisashi checked something on his phone, then perked up and led the way down the corridor to a different sector. Let's see, he muttered. Where is it? The tailor is in. He pointed to a small storefront designed to look like a wood-paneled closet. There was a small golden plaque on the door that Izuku couldn't read at this distance. Approaching it, the text resolved itself into a finely scripted brand name and a byline. Bespoke suiting since Izuku blanched. You're getting me a suit? Hisashi raised a brow. Why not? After all, he stared pointedly at Izuku's shirt, it's hardly the first time you've gone along with one of my schemes. The schemes? You've never once hinted to anyone at what you've done. What you helped me do dash. No. What you've done. Izuku looked down at his plain, black shirt and pants and remembered why he hadn't worn them in so long. His voice, he hoped, betrayed none of his sudden panic as he replied, Fair enough. What kind of suit were you planning on getting me? Something black, I think, Hisashi smiled, ringing the doorbell. Hides bloodstains. Izuku carefully kept his grimace off his face at the memory. Inko's phone dinged with a new message from Hisashi. She opened it and promptly burst into giggles, drawing attention from passers-by and her son's homeroom teacher, who was accompanying her through this portion of the supermarket to get snacks for all the 1A problem children. He was supposed to be guarding Midoriya and his father, too, but the man was painfully weak to being mothered and Inko had taken blatant advantage of that to give Izuku some time with his father for once. Look at this. she wheezed, holding her phone up to the pro hero. Ha ha. It was a photo of Izuku in some fancy shop, staring pleadingly at the camera while 3 different people measured him with tape and a 4th person held several swatches of fabric up against his arms. He's miserable, she giggled again, wiping at her eyes. Hisashi, you scoundrel. A second photo arrived. Izuku was fumbling with the cufflinks of a very nice black shirt. His little frown. He looks so determined. Inko laughed so hard she snorted, and that only made it worse. Aizawa waited patiently for her to catch her breath, a very unimpressed look on his face. Oh, don't worry about them, Inko hand-waved. Hisashi is a pest, but he means no harm. He's much better than he used to be. A raised eyebrow. Inko's cheeks pinked as she realized the slip. Walk with me, she said more quietly, and I'll explain. Several years ago. Inko's phone buzzed loud enough to wake her up, with the distinct ringtone she'd picked for her husband. It was 2 a.m. What the hell? Hisashi. She yawned, squinting at the screen as the video feed loaded. Then, oh no, Hisashi, what happened? Her husband looked terrible, like he hadn't bathed since he left, with shadows under his eyes, and was that a bruise on the side of his face? And the haunted look of him, the way he kept glancing off-screen at something Inko couldn't see, he was in trouble. Inko, he said, voice hoarse, I have a problem. And he explained, in halting words, just what that problem was. Inko couldn't believe she'd never noticed at the time, but in hindsight, when she had time to think about it the next day, it made a lot of sense. Hisashi's mercurial moods, the way he would sometimes stay out later than he intended, the way he was always emptying the trash before she got home from her own outings. I've been hiding my struggle with substance abuse since we got married, the man on the screen choked out, and she listened to the entire painful story, feeling cold and furious and more exhausted than she'd been when she went to bed. Apparently, his luck in avoiding the authorities had finally caught up to him when he went overseas, and an American underground hero had caught him during a larger sting operation on street dealers. Thankfully, the state he'd been arrested in was one that believed more in rehabilitation than punishment, and he'd been offered a deal, a year in rehab, and he would avoid time in prison. I know it's not enough to undo what I've done, Hisashi's voice quavered. But I'll keep sending money home. Until you come back, Inko nodded solemnly. Hisashi hesitated. Looked past the screen again. That I don't know when I'll come back, he whispered. It's better if I don't return, for a while. I'm a danger to Izuku like this. Inko had protested, but he'd refused to hear any alternatives. I'm so sorry, Inko, he said, tears welling up in his eyes. I promise, I'm going to change. And we were out of contact for several years after that, Inko concluded to the wide-eyed Aizawa, picking out several boxes of frozen dumplings from the shelf. He got in touch with me again yesterday, a bit out of the blue, and spent all morning apologizing and promising to make it up to me. They hadn't discussed finances, but the lump sum that had arrived in her accounts at noon had been a very clear indication of his sincerity, she thought. Not to judge, the man murmured, but you trust that promise? He's kept all the others, she said. Monthly funds, adjusted for inflation, and, well, he has changed, Inko supposed. Hisashi never had much interest in our son before. I used to think it was the diagnosis unexpressed quirk, she explained, as close to quirkless as you get nowadays, but seeing them, I think it was the drags that dulled his mind. He was never this happy before. Just then, they were rejoined by the detective, Tsukachi, who'd stepped out for a phone call. The man looked deathly pale as he reached them. Midoriya-san, he managed to gasp out, catching his breath. Do you know where your son and husband are? We need to regroup. Oh, well, Inko checked her phone. It was nearly 11. Goodness, time sure flew. Hisashi says they've finished up at the tailor's. They're going to the Hero merch store now. Great, Aizawa said. Let's check out and get going. Hisashi reviewed the message Inko had sent him. They're meeting us here soon, he informed Aizu, who most likely didn't hear him. Green eyes turned his way. Sorry, I didn't catch that dash, of course. What did you say? Your mother and the others are meeting us at the merch store in a short while. Don't fuss with the tie, Aizu, It's perfectly tied. Oh, but why do I need a tie anyway? Izuku flexed his hands, not quite glaring at the scrap of fabric. It's a combat hazard. You can take it off once your mother's gotten her photos, Hisashi offered, ever generous. Izu stopped. Photos? You promised evidence, he squeaked. I'm never going to hear the end of this. He lengthened his stride, walking with purpose now in the direction of the merch store and its considerable line. Are we going to have to wait? Hisashi asked quietly, grimacing. Izuku snorted. Of course not. Follow my lead. Izuku had been a regular at Double Plus Ultra Kiyoshi. Hisashi'd made an odd choked laugh at the sign, earlier when he'd seen it, for a while, and with that came, well, perks. He greeted the employee manning the entrance by name with a bright smile, Tanaka-san, good morning, and was waved on through, heedless of the several people who stared in annoyance or, more likely, envy. The majority of the shop was empty of people. The first 2 hours of pre-order days were reserved for pickups only, so the staff wouldn't be overwhelmed. Most of the time, they would have 3 people at the counter, 2 in the back rooms, and 2 at the front doors. Izuku could only assume they were short-staffed today, as when he reached the back counter, there were only 2 people, both already looking exhausted, repeating the same lines to each person. The DLVRY had come in late, pre-orders were still being processed, they'd need another 30 minutes. May we text you when your order is ready? Several people gawked at Izuku and Hisashi just cutting in line, but the most scandalized reaction yet came when the turquoise-skinned clerk with her bright purple antennae looked up and recognized Izuku, and paused in calling up the next customer to rush over to him instead. It's Mikumo-kun, she said, brightening, both in demeanor and actual color. We have your order finished in the back, just a moment. Izuku could feel Hisashi's stare burning a hole in the back of his head. What? He muttered. I'm not going to waste a perfectly good alias. The supervillain clasped his hands behind his back, failing to suppress his amusement. I wouldn't dare to criticize, he murmured back, just as quietly. Though if you're open to more, how about Shigaraki Mikumo? That brought Izuku up short. What? Don't tell me, he hissed. Is that your actual surname? He had the sudden, vivid mental image of being introduced to the leader of the League of Villains by a very self-satisfied all-for-one as, your brother, Tamura, now get along. Hisashi merely winked, standing taller to survey the rest of the room. If he had any distaste for the shelves upon shelves of action figures, costumes, toys, and stationery in garish hero colors, he didn't voice it, but he did seem rather shocked by the size of the shopping bags the clerk retrieved for Izuku from the back when they were set down on the counter. Hey, the next person in line complained, is he seriously getting his stuff that fast? You said it was a half-hour wait. 1 moment, sir, the clerk said. No, this is ridiculous. Dear Lord, was that guy about to pitch a fit in the middle of the store like an actual child? Something about him pinged Izuku's senses, but it didn't completely register until he pulled out a gold card and slapped it on the counter with a gloved hand. I'm an 8-tier member. A couple people behind them oohed and awed. Double Plus Ultra memberships were ranked by several factors, but the biggest one was how much you spent. So Izuku felt extremely smug when he reached into his wallet and pulled out a black card with a holographic store logo. Witness. Me, he bared his teeth. Austere. The 8-tier swore under his breath. Oh, and while I'm here, Izuku said brightly, can I get the paintable figure set for the Kamino incident? He pointed to the top shelf behind the counter. Hey, that's the last one. I know, Izuku smiled even wider, baiting him. I saw you staring at it. That's why I'm getting it. A day ago, he might not have tried antagonizing the guy like this, but right now, there was more than just one for all thrumming eagerly beneath Izuku's skin, and a certain gleeful, malicious part of him just couldn't help himself. The sheer hatred in the eyes, shadowed by the 8-tier's worn gray hoodie, was feeding him like nothing else. You beach, the guy spat. What, you're gonna fight me over a toy? Izuku smirked at him. Hypocritical, he knew. He had totally fought someone over merch before. You see, quirkless brawling didn't legally count as assault nowadays. I can try, was the growled reply. The 8-tier looked like he was 10 seconds away from throwing hands. Hands. Izuku obliged him, then, by stepping closer, into the guy's personal space. Don't worry, he said lowly, laying a hand deceptively gently on his shoulder. I'm just playing ya, Tamura, it's all for you. Shigaraki froze. What? He stepped back with a wink. I mean, I don't know when your birthday is, so it would have been a surprise either way, right? Dad thought it was funny. Izuku thumbed over his shoulder at Hisashi and watched the way Tamura's eyes moved, and his whole body froze as he realized who was looking back at him.
Yeah.
Izuku wasn't going to get tired of that anytime soon. Tamura, Hisashi greeted, no doubt grinning like the madman he was. You remember Mikomo? A broad hand plopped down atop Izuku's fluff ball of a hairstyle. The villain blinked several times between the two of them, and then face-bombed. DMN. I should have known. Gentlemen, your orders are ready, said the staff member, no doubt having watched the whole interaction like a soap opera was unfolding in front of her. Haida-san, the other clerk, was helping the rest of the line. Hisashi passed Izuku a credit card that was very reminiscent of the one Endeavor gave Shudo to pay for both his and Tamura's stuff. Izuku signed it one for all just because he could, and passed Tamura the bag with the Kamino figurine set as promised. We gotta go, he explained to the flabbergasted villain, but hey, add me on Clamor? Yamikomo number 999. Tamura nodded, dazed, and took out his phone to do just that. Izuku, meanwhile, was following a shopping bag-laden Hisashi out of the store, to where Inko, Aizawa-sensei, and the detective were all waiting for them. His mom burst into a fit of giggles at the sight of him, and immediately started snapping pictures. Look what you've done, Izuku said to Hisashi, dry as the desert. What did I say? We'll never hear the end of this. You look so cute. Inko squealed. Izuku ran an exasperated hand through his hair. His bangs flopped right back in his face. He looks like he needs to see a barber, Aizawa muttered. Hisashi had a particular gleam in his eye. No, Dad, I'm not getting a haircut. Izuku was getting a haircut. He'd realized the moment his words left his mouth that he wasn't going to get his way, so he compensated by demanding the most expensive salon in the mall. It wouldn't do much to dent the treasury of the world's most powerful supervillain, but the thought counted. Didn't it? Todoroki's enthusiastic use of Endeavor's credit card was making a lot of sense. Throwing money at his problems also gave Izuku the benefit of meeting a very high-end stylist with a super cool hair-related quirk and an expert's keen eye, who took one look at his bird's nest mop and, squinting, asked, Honey, did you know you're going white at the roots? He was? I did not know that, Izuku blinked. Is it new? Surely his hair couldn't grow enough to show a new color in just a day, since he'd activated all for one for the first time dash? They took a comb and pulled a few strands out. More than 2 weeks ago, by standard reckoning. So, ever since he'd fought Overhaul, probably? Now, I can work with it to get you a really nice multicolor style, if you like, or my quirk can dye it all one color. How much did he want to terrify All Might when he got back to you? You look so handsome, Izuku, his mom gasped when he came out of the salon. Stand with your father, I want to get a photo of you too. Are you going to send that to Yagi-sensei? Izuku asked. At Inko's nod, he shared a glance with Hisashi and put on his brightest sunshine-wide grin for the camera, the kind that would melt his mentor's heart in any other situation. A second photo, where he slouched and grimaced like a yakuza on a smoke break, and a third, where he copied Hisashi's stance and facial expression perfectly, which made Inko giggle again. Detective Tsukachi didn't seem to enjoy the similarities between them, if his pallor was any indication. Izuku took yet another bit of ironic glee from the whole situation. Thankfully, for the detective, Izuku was having fun here. Aizawa-sensei checked his phone and announced that it was time to leave. If you don't have anything else to do. Izuku opened his mouth, then hastily shut it under his teacher's red-eyed glare. Toshinori may or may not have been hiding in his apartment on UA's campus, watching the security feeds from his computer, when his phone dinged with a text from Inko. He'd set a custom ringtone, similar to the one for his priority messages, so no one would question him immediately checking it. He braced himself before he opened it, justifiably paranoid and worried, but still ended up coughing blood all over his desk. Spite, and the motivation for petty vengeance, drove him to his computer, to the file with the contact info Midoriya Hisashi had left a day ago, and to a WikiHow page on spoofing. Your phone number for texts, because he Manuel wasn't risking All for One getting his actual number when he sent the BSTRD a text of his own. The car was waiting at the gates while Aizawa's ID and information validated with the security system, when Hisashi's phone chirped. I can't believe you've done this. He snorted. So Inko had sent All Might those photos too? He'd assumed as much, but hadn't expected this reaction. It was even funnier than he could have predicted. Would it be childish to reply? Oh, temptation. New message from +814547741111. 1208. Toshinori didn't know which was worse. The phone number he was sending from, or the emoticon. Of course, All for One would even text like a psychopath. He looked up at the security feeds again. The gate was opening. Toshinori grimaced. The walls wouldn't have stopped All for One, but it still rankled that they were just letting him in. Oh, how he wished young Midoriya knew the truth. Izuku froze halfway out of the car as realization dawned. Holy shit. All for One is on UA grounds. How the hell did he manage to negotiate his way into his enemy's stronghold? Nedzu was giving them an apartment in the dorms. Speaking of which, sheet, parental supervision. Actually, scratch that, he'd met Tamura. All for One clearly didn't supervise. All good, Aizu? The villain in question loomed over the open door. What? Oh yeah, I'm fine, Izuku offered a shaky grin. Lost in thought for a second. He stepped out, several shopping bags in hand, and elbowed the door closed behind him. Hisashi grinned back, hefting several bags of his own in each hand. Mom and Detective Tsukachi had the rest, as Aizawa-sensei was busy with his actual job as their security detail. Not too lost, I hope. You've yet to introduce me to everyone. Izuku looked over to the front of Heights Alliance, where all of 1A were gathered to gawk at the very fancy car and its now visible occupants, and thought, showtime. Hey guys. I'm back, he called out, holding up the bags, with snacks. Snacks, Kirishima bellowed. Oh, this is going to be a circus. This was a complete circus, Shoyuta thought miserably. Why in the world Nedzu had decided to let Problem Child's parents not just visit campus, but move in, he had no idea. No, scratch that, he had plenty of ideas. Mainly, the principal thrived on the chaos like some kind of ancient evil and found the whole thing funny, so just when the 1A problem children were finally starting to mellow out, he felt some obligation to throw new problems into the mix. Shoyuta was going to ask for a raise. At least Midoriya Inko wasn't a gremlin like the rest of them. She'd enlisted Naomesa's help in bringing in the groceries for her apartment kitchen, seeing as the students' groceries were in the hands of Problem Child and Problem Parent, and gotten neatly out of the way for a while. If Shoyuta were able to at the moment, he would thank her for her help. The Problem Duo. Hover. Whoa, Deku, is that your dad? You guys match, that's adorable dash. Kinda like a Pokemon champion dash. Hold up, they don't look that over-the-top dash. Shoyuta was going to get a headache from all the noise. You know, that's a nice suit, Yaoyorozu observed. Did you get it while you were out? Oh, this. Midoriya tugged at his sleeve, flashing the shiny gold cufflinks on his wrists. Yeah, we got it tailored at the mall earlier. The shop that looks like dash. A closet? That's one of my family's businesses, she exclaimed. But, are you saying you just walked in? They're by appointment. Are they? Midoriya blinked. I mean, nobody stopped us. He looked to his father. Did you make an appointment ahead of time? But then you wouldn't have been surprised that they were open, he went on, trailing off into muttering. Simpler, Aizu, Hisashi smirked. I bribed them. Midoriya just face-bombed. Of course, I should have known. A dramatic gasp. Why Aizu is my favorite son expressing disapproval of my dubious ways. However will I go on? As a dash, Hisashi swooned. Respectable citizen? Midoriya rolled his eyes, but he was smiling. It's okay, Dad, he patted the man on the shoulder. I don't expect an old dog to learn new tricks. Old? Hisashi feigned being stricken. Positively decrepit, Midoriya agreed. But we have lots of duct tape to hold you together. Was that Shinso, hidden behind the others? Wheezed. Shudo's mental image of Midoriya Hisashi, as formed 2 days ago when Izuku first mentioned him, had not been flattering. Granted, he hadn't had a lot to work with, only Izuku's vague description of a parent he barely knew, and the knowledge that Hisashi made him nervous, which, despite Izuku saying it wasn't like the situation in the Todoroki household, had drawn strong parallels the moment the words, fire breath quirk, came out of Izuku's mouth. So Shudo had prepared himself for the possibility of meeting a Midoriya Hisashi who was much like Todoroki Enji. What he hadn't been prepared for was the actuality of Midoriya Hisashi being this much like his son. Is technically cold fusion, have you tested any of the heavy elements, or would that be illegal nowadays? Ugh, I forgot how backwards Japan is about scientific research. I'd argue it's more a psionic ability anchored to lipids as a conduit for summoning material from outside the universe. That makes a lot more assumptions than it has to, but may still be more correct. Shudo watched Yaoyorozu blink at the two Midoriyas talking at each other about her quirk, visibly concerned. Yaoyorozu was concerned. Shudo was used to Izuku and thus only mildly perturbed. Even anchored to lipids anyway? There are multiple energetic cell processes. It could be a specific intermediate enzyme. You could just ask her, Dad, Izuku pointed out, which was when Hisashi seemed to remember Yaoyorozu was there and turned his full attention on the quirk user in question. Stiffened eyes widening, like a deer in headlights. Oh, is that what Izuku meant about intense? Well, that was kind of hypocritical, wasn't it? It was the same look Izuku gave anyone when he was interested in their quirk. He'd just never been on the other end because his own came in so late. This is my friend Shudo. Izuku's voice brought him out of his thoughts. When had Hisashi stopped pestering him, studying Yaoyorozu? Also, had Izuku just called him his friend, like, out loud? Shudo willed his cheeks not to redden, and hoped he succeeded. Then, a pleasure to meet you, Shudo-kun. There was a looming figure in front of him, backlit so his face was almost obscured, reaching out a hand to shake. Midoriya Hisashi had no business being that tall. So this was what it was like for Momo. No wonder she was scared. Likewise, Midoriya-san, he managed to say. Hisashi smiled down at him, and his teeth really did gleam the same way Izuku's did when he grinned like that, and it was just as menacing as when Izuku did it. So, the man began, and Shudo braced himself for a barrage of the usual questions about his quirk. What's the latest on the Dad Might conspiracy? Hitoshi watched Todoroki blue screen at the subject change, choking and sputtering, and tried to keep a straight face. By the amused gleam in Izuku's eyes, he'd failed, but his friend simply winked, before pointedly refocusing on Todoroki and Midoriya Hisashi. That it feels right to believe you are Midoriya's father, Todoroki managed at last, but that is only anecdotal evidence and not scientifically proven. Was Todoroki sweating? Under Hisashi's sharp gaze and sharper grin? You could be a paid actor, or a user of a specialized quirk, or a victim of one meant to disguise the facts. Fair enough, Hisashi grinned even wider, but have you considered that the evidence of All Might's paternity is what was faked? Oh hell, was Hisashi really going to engage with Todoroki's conspiracies on his level? The reflexive disbelief on Todoroki's face turned contemplative as Hisashi bent to murmur something in his ear. Whatever he said to him changed his expression even further, caused his face to pale, his jaw to slacken, and when Izuku's father stepped back again, Todoroki was more astonished than Hitoshi had ever seen him. No way, Hitoshi thought he was mouthing silently, as he stared at Izuku like he was seeing the truth of him for the very first time. Izuku rolled his eyes, exasperated, and closed a hand around Hisashi's wrist to gently but insistently guide him away. Hisashi didn't move yet. He clapped a hand on Todoroki's tank-top-clad shoulder heavy enough Todoroki's knees buckled. Let me know what you think after you've had time to look, he insisted. Dad, cut it out, Izuku whined. Let's meet my other friends, okay? If Todoroki seemed to regain his footing after being called Izuku's friend, Hitoshi pretended not to notice. Izuku could not believe how well that worked. He didn't want to know what Hisashi'd said to Shudo, but his shock clearly covered the subsequent stealing, copying, and return of his quirk. Half hot, half cold, was a very energetic ability. Practically leaping to his command, he stifled it as quickly as he could, to experiment with later, and moved on to Uraraka, Ida, and Shinso. Hisashi's ease with initiating handshakes and shoulder claps while he spoke to people was ridiculous, and as long as Izuku held unobtrusively onto his wrist, the power of All for One was with him. He was so hyped to try and study Uraraka's gravity quirk, it wasn't just floating things, he was sure, and breaking down Ida's engine into components to recombine later. Shinso, he was going to be a way tougher guy to get a copy off of. He didn't readily accept any physical contact, no matter how short a time frame, and he also rarely slept, which further narrowed their window of opportunity. Perhaps if they got the drop on him and Hisashi used a quirk that could modify memory, wasn't there a villain rumored to have that ability, some information broker in the underground? Hisashi surprised Izuku by not offering Shinso a hand at all. It surprised Shinso, too, who'd clearly expected the overbearing behavior, judging by the hunch of his shoulders and the tension in his stance. He nodded a greeting, beginning to relax again. "Nice to meet you, Midoriya-san." "Likewise, Shinso Hitoshi." Hisashi smiled politely. Then, more quietly, so that Izuku doubted anyone but Jair might have heard, "I believe I knew your parents." Shinso went very still. His eyes flicked between Hisashi and Izuku with something like dawning understanding or dread. "But have we met before?" he asked in a murmur, not a whisper, because whispers carried. "It's nice to see," Hisashi answered without answering, "what good friends there are here, for my son." Izuku put the pieces together with terrible ease. All for One clearly had a pattern of rescuing victims of child abuse. Shinso had been in the foster system, which meant he probably knew exactly who Hisashi was. But further contemplation of that little fact was abruptly, luckily, cut short by the high, delighted shriek that rang out from the doorway. Eri had arrived on the scene. "Deku!" she cried, dashing out of Aizawa's reach and into his arms. "You're back." "Yup," Izuku offered a winning smile. "I sure am." "You got a makeover," she informed him solemnly, as if he wasn't aware. "Now you look just like Dash." She froze, looking over his shoulder with startled eyes, and Izuku braced himself, because did she remember lending Riwen to Uncle Sashi? What? Eri wriggled out of Izuku's hold and ran right up to Hisashi, who had to kneel to accept the hug the child was offering. Being over 7 feet tall had its drawbacks sometimes, didn't it? "Hello again, Miss Eri," he returned politely. "I see you're doing well." "It's been forever," said Eri seriously. Then she giggled as Hisashi swept her up onto his shoulder. "Yay! How do you know Mr. Hisashi, Eri?" asked Ishido in that particular tone of voice people always use with small animals and kids. "The rest of us only met him today." "He was Grandpa's Aniki," Eri announced from the high ground. Grandpa kept their sake cups on a shelf. Despite the looks that everyone was now sending each other, Hisashi, and him, Izuku felt only relief that this meant Eri didn't recognize All for One as, well, All for One. He should have known she wouldn't. Normal children weren't expected to keep such things secret. He'd been special. Several years ago, Izuku twitched awake at the buzz of his phone under his pillow, 3:15. He thumbed the alarm off and slid soundlessly out of bed, into the stillness of the silent night air. It was the work of minutes to change into the plain clothes he'd prepared hours earlier, to comb his hair back with gel and hide it under a knit cap. A bag, similarly readied well ahead of time, sat by the bedside table. His phone, now on silent, received a notification. 1 minute later, he stepped into the portal that opened in front of him. Problem Child's mother had decided to make everyone dinner, which meant she and several other students, and Eri, had already started cooking. This was an improvement only in that Shoyuda could devote his specific attention to Problem Parent again, in the process of re-evaluating just what kind of problem he should expect him to be. Yakuza ties. That explained so much about Midoriya Hisashi, actually. His absence from the paperwork submitted with Midoriya's UA application. His actual absence, of several years' span, that Shoyuta had noted idly on the background check Nedzu ran on all applicants. It explained why he wasn't a hero, despite having a strong and marketable quirk, one that he was currently and grudgingly demonstrating for several members of 1A outside the dorm. "It's a fire hazard, so we'll go outside," Hisashi had said, simple as, oblivious to the incredulous looks from Bakugo and Todoroki. "I don't care if the building is fireproof. You don't play with fire or explosives indoors." Hisashi was old-fashioned, like a grandparent, or like someone raised according to strict traditions, Shoyuta saw. He had a fondness for pre-quirk and early quirk history, and an insistence that many significant past events weren't recorded accurately, that implied he had seen the real histories, and what better place would they be kept than in an underworld group's family library? And Shinso knew him. Shinso knew him. Shoyuta had few illusions about the kind of life his student had lived prior to UA's dorms. He knew better than to ask. The way he was studiously avoiding looking even in the man's direction said almost as much as Todoroki's calculating stares sent at problem child. And Todoroki. Todoroki was the son of a big-name pro, one high up in the commission and with access to, or credit on, many of the country's biggest cases. His son would have seen and overheard more about criminal organizations than most sidekicks did, had probably been grilled on the known players in the underworld, the untouchables with politicians in their pockets, who couldn't be arrested without the most solid evidence, before he even went for his internships. Did he want to know what Hisashi had said to Todoroki? Problem parent didn't carry himself like a criminal, though. Even when he'd been confronted with 2 pros and a civilian detective, in his own home, unannounced at an early hour. Shuda's entire line of work depended on his understanding of body language, and Hisashi simply didn't move like a combatant. He looked and dressed and acted like a businessman, as morally gray as anyone who made their fortune in business was. Add to that what Inko had said about a supposed drag problem and years in rehab, a plea deal if Shoyuta had ever heard one, and it seemed ever more likely that Hisashi was simply a financier, one who'd gotten in good with the shy Hasaikai in Eri's grandfather's time, and very carefully picked a good time to get out. Yeah, that made sense. Eri's grandfather had been an old man, and he'd called Hisashi his Aniki. How old was Midoriya Hisashi anyway? Izuku watched Aizawa watch Hisashi and just knew he was drawing conclusions. Probably not the right conclusions, not yet, but he'd get there eventually, if Nedzu didn't just tell him. Why hadn't Nedzu told him? Why hadn't All Might when he got back from dinner yesterday? Tsukachi had introduced himself as All Might's civilian representative, and even he hadn't known. This was odd. Unless... He glanced out the window to where Hisashi was continuing his fire breath demonstration, shooting a whip-thin jet of flame some 20 meters into the air like a signal flare. Shuda was taking notes on his phone, shaping his hand in different ways to mimic the tongue control method in fire breath. Eri was cheering and clapping her uncle, Sashi, from a safe distance. Now she'd gotten bored of cooking lessons. He didn't just have a little cousin, he had an older brother, who he'd told to message him on Clamor more than 2 hours ago. "Back in a minute," Izuku said loudly for the benefit of anyone within hearing range, and fled upstairs to the bathroom nearest his room, frantically unlocking his phone. Musing over Nedzu's true loyalties would wait until later. He needed to follow up with Tamura now. Sure enough, Shigi number 000 sent a friend request. Accept decline block? Izuku accepted it, opened the P2P encrypted Holocom app, and sent Tamura a link to friend him there, instead. Less than 10 seconds passed before the first message came over Holocom. "Shigs, Abra. What the F is going on? Long story, Tamura NII. Don't call me NII-san. Okay. You even type like Sensit. Is he really your old man? Not exactly. He's kind of adopted me?" And unlocked the copy of his quirk within One for All. Izuku meant to backspace that last bit, but he hit send instead. There was a long 30 seconds between then and Shigaraki's reply. "I guess you can call me NII-san if you want." Izuku beamed at his phone. Laughing face. "Great BC to Munii, you won't believe the bullshit going on today." "You swear?" "Only when no one who knows Kaken is around to hear it." "Kaken?" "Exactly. Wait, the explosion's brat? Face with tears of joy. Let's get back on topic. No, that's hilarious. Dad is in plain sight at you. The kid we rescued from Overhaul just recognized him as the Aniki of the old boss of the Shai Hasaikai. What? I helped him copy a bunch of my classmates' quirks. What, wait, copy? Turns out having 2 AFO users lets you perform a duplication exploit. Stuyo, Dalsitf. So to Munii, can I copy your quirk? Actually, wait. Even better idea. All for one might be a little bit of a bad influence on Izuku's metrics for reasonable behavior. You should come to UA as my older brother. Bruh. Come on, it'll be funny. It'll give Kaken a heart attack. The more he thought about it, the better it got. Come on, if Dad can do it, so can you. Just put on moisturizer and comb your hair. If you don't bring the hands, it's plausible deniability. Or you can claim to be your own twin brother. They never see through that one. Yamikumo. You absolute mad lad. I use her as my dump stat. This chaotic BS is impossible for me. What new? I don't have charisma. You got All Might to give you his quirk. You got Sensei to give you his quirk. There is no way you don't have high charisma. No, it's just plot armor to Munii, please. Izuku tried desperately to cover his maniacal giggles with one hand while he typed with the other. Look, the loopholes in security here still haven't been closed in the time I've been tracking them. Nedzu is practically inviting guests. I was thinking ABT it earlier, but he might be on our side actually. It's a loose hypothesis, but there is no way he doesn't know the situation, but he isn't doing anything to stop him? He hasn't told anyone from the staff that's present. Somehow All Might hasn't even shown up. It's suspicious. Yami, that just sounds like a trap for the rest of us. It could be? Izuku had deliberately not let himself overthink it yet. But if Tartarus couldn't hold All for One, is there really any prison that can? It was one of the Americans' black sites until the breakout. Wait, how do you know that? That isn't that common knowledge? Nobody in Tartarus got a trial. It's suspiciously well built for something under Japanese bureaucracy. It's in the middle of the ocean, hence international waters. Obviously not a lot is known about the other black sites remaining in the world. One of them is supposedly orbiting the planet in low atmo, but I'm pretty sure he has every status immunity imaginable and will survive anyway. Do you really aren't someone to be F'd with, are you? Smiley face. It not like I have anything better to do. Warmer there than out here. Where are you, to Munii? Somewhere I won't be in 20 minutes. I'll tell Dad. No, let me tell him Izuku might be a little bit of a bad influence on Tamura's metrics for reasonable behavior. According to his phone, it had been 12 minutes since he went up here. He should probably go back downstairs, but only once Tamura got back to him. He could change into something less Hisashi, but that would defeat the purpose of terrorizing All Might, which he kind of really wanted to do. Although, was it scarier if he wore All Might merch while looking like Hisashi? Yes, it would. Izuku went into his room, picked out a more Izuku-typical outfit, and hung the suit up nice and neat on the back of a chair to be dealt with later. By the time he checked his phone again, he beamed at what he saw. Sensei says okay. What a Chad. He's the best, isn't he? Still weird hearing that from you of all people, hero kid. Don't you know? Yamikumo is a villain name. Smiley face. Barring any major updates, we will reconvene tomorrow at noon. Good day, everyone. Tashinori slumped back in his chair the moment the virtual conference ended, clicking over to UA's security feeds. There wasn't anything new on the screens, but it was better than doing nothing at all. He still wasn't sure how this of all things ended up being the plan, but here it was. Some 20 hours ago he'd been chomping at the bit to report All for One, Midoriya Hisashi, to the Commission, no, to Interpol, but Nedzu had convinced him otherwise with just one sentence. What do you think would happen to Izuku? He'd put his face in his hands. Izuku, his successor, who had no idea he was All for One's son. The Commission wouldn't just cut his career short, they'd take his life. One for All would be lost with its 9th user, and then they would never be able to defeat the Scourge of Kamino. So he'd gone through today's meeting of the Tartarus Task Force with his fists clenched out of view of the webcam, keeping a straight face as the Commission representative droned on about having no new leads, and when Naomasa had texted him asking what the hell was going on with Midoriya Hisashi. Can't explain over phone, he'd texted back. Just keep me updated. It was a testament to their mutual trust and friendship that the detective didn't ask anything else. Click, click, click. Toshinori cycled through the camera feeds he'd favorited in the window. UA's gates, empty but for passing cars. The yard outside the Heights Alliance dorm, where young Bakugo and young Todoroki were showing their quirks off for young Eri under Aizawa's supervision. The dorm's kitchen and dining room, where some students were cooking under Inko's supervision, all for one watching from where he'd been relegated to a chair, idly scrolling on the phone in his hands. He hadn't seen young Midoriya on the feeds yet, he'd been engrossed in the task force meeting when they arrived. Now, his successor wasn't anywhere on the cameras at all, although the tracking chip did say he was in the building. In his room, perhaps? For obvious reasons, there wasn't a camera in the room to check. Another click brought him back to the gates, again, just as blank as before. Toshinori yawned, looked away, looked back, and saw two civilians in fashionable clothes and trendy backpacks walk up to the security gate. One reached for the intercom, but was stopped by the other, who gesticulated wildly in the direction of the wall and said something that Toshinori couldn't lip-read from the camera's distance, but they were plenty close enough to the intercom for him to pick up the tail end of their argument through the audio feed. Let me do it, Dumps. I'm the one with the excuse to be here dash. We both have an excuse or I wouldn't have asked you dash. A gloved finger on the latter's lips, silencing him. Shut, said the first, whose voice was deeper between the two of them. I've got this. With that, he turned to face the intercom properly. With a steadying breath, he at last pressed the buzzer and spoke, in a tone that suggested elocution lessons. Good afternoon. We have been asked to come to UA as part of the Midoriya family evacuation protocol. The pause. I think we're at the right gate? Oi, did you get a map or some sheet? He hissed at his friend, in a much more informal accent. The friend shrugged. Toshinori squinted at the both of them, on screen, puzzling over whether he'd seen either of them before. Before he got much of a look, though, Nedzu picked up the intercom. That's right, the principal exclaimed, gleeful, from his end of the connection. Wait there, you two, and we'll send a staff member to retrieve you. Shouldn't be long. The visitors reeled, surprised. Okay, thanks, nodded the one who'd addressed the intercom. On the next camera feed, Aizawa was getting up to leave the vicinity. Toshinori's heart sank, disappointed that he was being left out again. Yagi, would you mind going with Aizawa to escort those two to 1A? Shoyuta was so tired. He'd had his scheduled patrol overnight, and then Eri had woken up right at dawn from a nightmare, and then Nedzu had sent him out with Tsukachi to get Problem Child and his parents, which was itself an ordeal, and now he'd spent the first half of the afternoon supervising 1A because the rest of the staff were already assigned to other work. And he couldn't even nap because Midoriya Hisashi was a FING mob financier and he didn't trust him as far as he could throw him. And now he was being sent to the gates to pick up some more of Problem Child's extended family, which he only knew because he'd overheard a conversation on the subject 2 hours ago while guarding the door to the Midoriya's temporary apartment. Hisashi, Inko coaxed, gently, I can see in your eyes that you have something to tell me, so just say it. Well, Hisashi began, audibly nervous, you remember how Miss Eri called me her uncle earlier dash. I do. She's very cute. Right? So, she may not be the only one I mean. The man's voice pitched up a notch, and Shoyuta abruptly remembered that Midoriya's mother's quirk was for moving small objects. AC, Inko honey please I need that kidney, thank you, I didn't think it was the right time, I only just got home, so dash. Hisashi, my dear husband, if you would simply tell me the situation without giving excuses? A choked gurgle. Am I correct in understanding you have adopted a second son? Without asking me. Yes. Is that a question or an answer, honey? Shoyuta was suddenly very grateful Problem Child only took after one of his parents. An answer, yes, I adopted him, he had nowhere to go I couldn't just leave him dash. Shoyuta gave up all pretense and pressed his ear against the door to listen further. Hisashi, presumably, was on the floor catching his breath. And how old is this second son of ours, He's 20 now dash. Oh, well that makes a lot more sense. Inko giggled. Shoyuta shivered. Here I thought he was Aries' age. I was so worried you'd abandoned another child, I overreacted a bit. It's fine, I understand why you'd worry, Inko dear, Hisashi coughed. He messaged me to check in a few minutes ago, what with the evacuation protocols, since he lives within travel distance of UA, you see dash. That's wonderful dear. I'll add a chair to the dinner table. Footsteps approaching the door, Shoyuta stepped hastily out of the way. He asked if he can bring a friend? Of course. The door opened, and Shoyuta was witness to the sunny smile on Midoriya's mother's face as she led Hisashi out by a solid hold on the wrist. Now, Hisashi, you don't have anything else to tell me before we go back downstairs, do you? The man glanced between Shoyuta and his wife, and plastered on a very false smile. Nothing that I can think of. No one called him out on the lie. Of course, on the way to the gates, he was joined by Yagi, who practically vibrated with anticipation while simultaneously looking as sleepless as Shoyuta was, further sapping what remained of Shuta's patience and energy. This all added up to a Shoyuta Aizawa who was completely unprepared for the two civilians that walked through the gate. You Racerhead? Gasped a young man with long silvery blue hair and thin-rimmed glasses. The other man had hair as white as half of Todoroki's and wow, a lot of gold jewelry in his face. He sighed a sigh that Shoyuta could relate to on a spiritual level. Get it together, idiot, he chided. You can ask for an autograph later. That set the first one to sputtering out protests that he was not a fan, he just heard about Eraserhead, is all. Stop laughing at me you absolute pest, which earned him a good-natured eye roll before the bejeweled man returned his attention to Shoyuta. And Yagi briefly, but mostly Shoyuta. Sorry about him. We're here to see family, not to gawk at every hero we meet. Grumbling from the other one under his breath that would have shocked a lesser man, but Shoyuta had to deal with Bakugo on a daily basis. Quit throwing me under the bus already, muttered the one with glasses, plucking at the tie on his suit. Which reminded Shoyuta of something a little more important. What are your names, anyway? The white-haired man sent him a look that Shoyuta found increasingly familiar, and summoned up an equal level of anticipatory dread. Tuya, he said. Todoroki Tuya. You can't just say it, the yet nameless civilian hissed. Witness protection, dipshit. And this is my roommate, Tuya said flatly, speaking over him. He is here for moral support. Yeah, Shoyuta saw the family resemblance. Tamura could not believe this was working. He toyed with a strand of his hair, suppressing the urge to scratch his neck. They had gotten into UA with only heavy makeup and a flimsy excuse. Was deception always this easy, or had associating with the green brat just turned down the entire game's difficulty? Dabi seemed content to mix truth and lies on the walk to the building where Sensei and the 1A brats were, with no fear of discovery whatsoever. To be fair, even Tamura hadn't recognized him once he washed the dye out of his hair and got the first layers of concealer on. Oi, didn't you bring a fidget cube? Dabi muttered back to him. Could have sworn I saw you pack one earlier. But thanks, Tamura muttered back, fumbling with the zipper on the posh little backpack he'd managed to stuff his gear into earlier. Minus the hands, which sat safely in, well, as safe, in the warehouse Kurogiri's portal had first brought them to. Tucked into a corner at the bottom, underneath the charger cables, and in the same pocket as the makeup kit and bottle of fancy skin cream, was the jet black cube he was looking for. Tamura did his best not to mess up the arrangement of the rest, because it had been hell getting it all to fit in there in the first place. It was a silent fidget cube, which was good, because Tamura was pretty sure Eraserhead would kill him if he started making clicking noises. The man looked more tired than he had at USJ, and that was when he'd been fighting in Numu and losing. Not that Tamura made a point of remembering what Eraserhead looked like. He wasn't a fan or anything. Dabi was going to tease him mercilessly though, and he knew it, but he didn't regret bringing the guy along. Just the look on his face when he'd told him they were going to What? We're going to dash. A hand in his face. Tamura would complain, but he was used to it from his villain gear. I heard you. I just don't know why. Tamura hesitated. Should he tell the truth? My little brother wants us to help torment the hero students by existing. That creates more questions than it answers, but I don't think I want to know. In the present, Tamura resisted the urge to tug at the collar of his shirt again, focusing his restless energy on the fidget cube. He hadn't spent over an hour applying quirk-enhanced skin creams and healing ointments to F it up again now. Nobody was really paying much attention to him, not with Dabi, or should he call him Tuya? Taking the brunt of small talk, he clearly looked different enough from his usual self to pass as someone else. Sensei would be thrilled to see him finally wearing a suit, but Tamura would weather the backhanded compliments like a pro. Tashinori was pleasantly surprised to meet young Todoroki's older brother, especially given that he'd been read into the record concerning Todoroki Tuya's alleged death. Had the Hero Commission put him in witness protection to support a future case against Endeavor? If that were the case, he could almost restore his hope for humanity. Oh, wait, no. Tuya knew Hisashi, and even Hisashi's civilian persona was still a criminal. This poor boy was probably picked up off the streets. And the same would apply to his so-called roommate, who Tashinori thought seemed familiar but couldn't place. This is Heights Alliance, Aizawa announced, stopping before the doors. We'll figure out a housing situation for you both by the end of the day. Your other relatives are probably in the kitchen now. He led on, past the curious stares of 1A students. Are those celebrities? Whoa, stylish dash. And into the dining room, where all for one stood up from the head of the table and, smiling, called Izuku over to meet your brother, Midoriya Tenko. The nervous-looking young man in the suit, oh God, how had he not realized, raised his head, adjusted his glasses, and held out a gloved hand to young Midoriya. Nice to meet ya, little brother, he nodded. Tashinori distantly realized he was going to faint. All might! Izuku cried, rushing over to support him as he slumped back against the wall. Are you okay? Tenko, Shimura Tenko, whipped around, wide-eyed behind a pair of glasses. How was it that glasses actually worked? All might, he breathed. The last thing Tashinori heard before he lost consciousness was Aizawa's muttered, "Problem family is empty," Shoyuta muttered, "and all the devils are here." He watched dispassionately as the newcomers assimilated into the chaos. Midoriya the older stared at the fallen All Might, going several shades paler, which put him at nearly paper white. He'd already looked like his only sunlight came from a computer screen when he got here, and Todoroki the older smirked, which was more expression than Shoyuta was accustomed to seeing from Todoroki the younger. "I'll help lift him," Uraraka offered as she dashed forward, Todoroki the younger at her side. The latter split off from helping Yagi to approach his brother, of course, leaving just Problem Child to help her move Yagi onto the nearest couch. Midoriya-san grabbed a footstool and sat down beside Yagi to fuss over him, and Problem Parent watched it all from as much a distance as Shoyuta did, wrestling with the evil grin that threatened to appear on his face. Figures. Not that Shoyuta didn't feel similar amusement at the reaction of his nuisance colleague. Speaking of nuisances and speaking of colleagues. Ida, he spoke up over the general commotion, go get recovery girl. Ida actually hesitated, eyes darting between Shoyuta and the rest of the room in a why me way. She's in her office, and she'll appreciate some help carrying over the 4 that All Might obviously needs if he's going around fainting when he gets a shock. Go. In actuality, he'd picked Ida because Ida was the loudest complainer about protocol and etiquette in the room, and the newcomers had already demonstrated their disregard for both, and Shoyuta would like a reprieve from scandalized, pearl-clutching, hypocritical exclamations for the next 30 minutes. Or 10. Whatever he could get. Problem Child, meanwhile, had finished moving Yagi and immediately gotten out of there when he saw his mother fawning over the man, and sending Hisashi smug looks every so often while she did it. Smart kid for all that he was chaos incarnate. Nobody needed that drama. Now the remainder of 1A was crowding him and Midoriya the older, Shoyuta was going to need to nickname him, that was much too long an epithet, and pelting them and the Todorokis with questions. You've got amazing hair, Ashido exclaimed at Midoriya too, good enough, what's your routine? Before the flummoxed young adult could answer, Yaoyorozu cried, that's another one of my family's suits. I'd recognize the style anywhere. Don't tell me you're also a regular? I'm Dash, Tenko began, looking panicked as he met Hisashi's eyes. If only I could convince him to dress this well all the time, problem parent sighed dramatically from the kitchen table. How did he get his voice to carry that well? Sadly not, though I have tried for years to convince him to look respectable. If I did, Tenko growled, sounding vaguely familiar actually, Shoyuta couldn't imagine where he'd heard his voice before, then I wouldn't have Dash. Don't let him get to you, Tenko-nai. Izuku laid a hand over the taller boy's face. Bakugo twitched and went pale, not that Shoyuta noticed it. Dad's just mad because, he leaned in and murmured something that Shoyuta couldn't hear, but which made Tenko stifle a wild cackle and shake his head free. Fine, player 2, he huffed a laugh. Whatever. Introduce me to all these brats so I can forget their names in 20 seconds? Cue another round of introductions. Shoyuta supposed teenagers never got tired of meeting new people. He could go without any more surprise characters for the next 12 hours, thanks. Bakugo, when it was his turn, glared and defiantly announced he was still gonna be the best hero out of everyone here, which earned a faint chuckle from Todoroki the older in the background. And this is Shuto, Izuku finished brightly, though I guess you guys know about him as much as you know about me. We should have some kind of brothers club. Gaming clan, Tenko suggested, glancing at Tuya. I mean, Stapleface and I already play League Dash. How about something newer, Tuya drawled, like the MMO you've been catfishing neats on all week. I know you have an actual account. I don't have a PC, Todoroki the younger pointed out. How about a group chat? Ooh, join our group chat. Hagakure leaped in the air from somewhere in the back of the crowd. The big clamor server with everyone in it, I mean. Sure, I guess. Tuya shrugged and pulled out a shiny gold, 100,000 yen phone. Uraraka staggered in the face of the obnoxious waste of money. Shuto stared at it, calculating. Then he announced, I'm going to get a new phone to match. With Endeavor's credit card. Add me to the family plan, Tuya suggested, exactly as deadpan. I'll let my other friends use it as a mobile hotspot. Let Tenko use the Wi-Fi to seed movie torrents, Problem Child suggested, and Shoyuta supposed he had better step in before they made any eviler plans under his nose, lest Endeavor hold him personally liable for the million-yen phone bill that would come of this. Before he actually bothered to step in, though someone, Kaminari, asked, what about you guys though, what are your quirks? Actually, Tenko said, I'm quirkless. Holy fing sheet. He'd actually said it. Dabi tried not to stare in open disbelief at the one person he knew had the most quirk accidents, boldly claiming he didn't have a quirk at all. From the look in Tamura's eyes, the gleeful BS dirty couldn't believe it either. The hero brats seemed shocked at his admission, especially Explosion's brat, who definitely knew what was up, from the look on his face, and now Dabi was trying really hard not to laugh. Greenie, Tamura's brother. Which seemed highly unlikely, unless he was Sensei's kid, and that would mean Midoriya Hisashi was all for one. Oh hell no. Anyway, Greenie was looking as surprised as the rest of the class, letting go of Tamura's wrist and opening his mouth to say something, but was interrupted by a loud chirping timer from the kitchen, and a green-haired woman's abrupt rise from beside the down symbol of peace. The whole group migrated into the dining area, sweeping Dabi and Tamura along. It was time for dinner. It was noisy enough that Dabi half expected All Might to wake up from his dramatic faint, but he didn't. More importantly, he got seated next to Shuto, opposite some purple-haired kid and Eraserhead. The other brats were piling into seats according to their usual seating order, or whatever. Dabi didn't pay attention to them so much. He was busy eyeing the head of the table where All for One was sitting. There was a yet empty chair on his left and Greenie on his right, and Tamura was sat next to Greenie, fidget cube in his hands. The moratorium on chatter held only as long as it took for green-haired lady, Midoriya. Inko, Shuto identified her in an undertone for Dabi's benefit, and several of the students to get all the serving dishes onto the table. Apparently Inko had a telekinetic quirk, so it was fast. Then, while stuffing their faces, the topic came up again. So, you're really quirkless? Exclaimed Ponytail Girl, between prim bites of a dumpling. Ugh, posh nonsense, Just eat it in one bite like it was meant to be eaten. Others joined in, expressing their surprise at how young Tamura was to be quirkless, or giving him sympathy for his diagnosis like it was some kind of disability, and that was starting to get on Dabi's nerves faster than he and Shudo could empty their bowls of delicious, cold soba, because his brother Natsuo was quirkless and practically the same age as him or Shigi. What the f did they teach kids these days? For the record, he decided to say, loudly, I'm also quirkless. Effectively. But why? Asked one kid with a kind of dumb face. What do you mean, effectively? Everyone's attention was on him now. Dabi attempted to be nonchalant. It's an overpowered fire quirk with no failsafe against getting burned. He gestured to his face and arms. Under all this makeup, it ain't pretty. This garnered several reactions. Shudo stopped eating his soba and stared at him contemplatively. I'd wondered about that. The report said you burned to death. From the pink girl with horns, that's makeup. And a tiny kid sitting next to Eraserhead gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. I don't use my curse either, she exclaimed, then confided, in what amounted to a stage whisper, I was scared for a long time. It made my papa disappear. What, like he left? Tamura asked bluntly. No, the girl turned wide red eyes on him. I reached out like this, she held out her hands, and he went poof. Tamura went very still, staring off into the middle distance. The tiny kid didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she was politely ignoring it, because she turned back to Dabi. I have control of it now though, I think. I could rewind the scars away. This was apparently a big deal, going by the way Eraserhead's head whipped around to look at her. Eri no. But I could. That's a very nice offer, Eri-chan? But I'm fine, Dabi said quickly. I've been living with the scars since I was a teenager. They're part of me now. Eri didn't seem satisfied with his answer, which was typical, until Greenie pointed out that since the power of rewind extended to the entire body, it would de-age Tuya by enough years that he wouldn't look the same, and he would probably feel really sad if his friends didn't recognize him. Somehow, that cheesy platitude did all the convincing that was necessary, and they went back to food. Or most of them did. What do you want, explosions kid? Tamura sneered at Bakugu, who was glaring back. Problem eating at the table with a quirkless person? My problem is that you FNG ain't, Bakugu snapped at last, rising from his seat. What the hell is all of this, specifically what the F dash? He began to walk around the table, toward them, and that was when Dabi noticed the temperature in the room had gotten a lot colder. He glanced at Shudo, but his brother wasn't doing it, so who was sending shivers down his spine? Kaken. Tamura's brother stepped in neatly to intercept Bakugu before he could get his sparking hands within punching distance. Can we talk for a minute? Outside? Deku, I'm not an idiot, that's dash. He was interrupted by Greenie's hand coming up to cover his mouth, fingers digging in harshly into his face. I wasn't asking, the hero brat smiled, dragging Bakugu by the forearm around the corner and into the hallway. That was kind of creepy, wasn't it? Dabi saw Tamura glance at all for one and then away again, with a shudder. Clearly, everyone in the room had had the same idea about eavesdropping, because they had gone quiet and were staring in the direction the two students had gone. There was a muffled yell, stifled by Greenie's hand, probably, and a soft thud against a wall, and then Midoriya was speaking, his voice carrying more than a private conversation deserved. Kaken, they heard, do you have a problem with my brother? Of course I do. Bakugu fumed, shockingly, quietly, that he is dash. Quirkless, Izuku must have covered his mouth again, stifling the yelling before it began. The way I was quirkless. Wait, that kid was quirkless? If he used to be quirkless and now he wasn't, and he was all for one's kid, did that mean dash? Dabi glanced at Shudo, whose eyes were the size of dinner plates, and nudged him. Did you know about this? He muttered under his breath. Shudo said nothing, only glanced in the direction of All for One, and Sheet. Okay, they were thinking the same thing about that, weren't they? Anyway, you weren't quirkless, Bakugu protested, gasping for air. You had a latent quirk dash. I was effectively quirkless and you bullied me for our whole lives over it. Midoriya interrupted, louder, and Bakugu squeaked, whatever struggles he was making subsiding. Do you think I forgot? My forgiveness only goes so far, Bakugu. He called him Bakugu, the pink-cheeked girl gasped. That's not Dash, Bakugu tried to interrupt, again, and there was another thud on the wall. Let me make this very clear for you, Midoriya hissed, his voice sending a chill down Dabi's spine the likes of which he hadn't felt since Kamino Ward. He noticed Tamura's hands trembling faintly too, where they were clasped in his lap. Whatever you have to say about Tenko and I do not want to hear it. If you even look at my brother the wrong way, look at me when I talk to you, Bakuga Dash, Tamura and Dabi both flinched, you will regret it. Do you understand? Silence, but Bakuga must have nodded, because Midoriya's voice was back to sunshine-friendly sweet right after. Great, he said. I'm glad we had this talk. Bakuga, noticeably, didn't follow him back into the room. Tamura wanted to restate, for the record, that he could not believe this was working. In one move, effortlessly, he'd made it very clear that, 1. Tamura was quirkless and 2. Nobody was allowed to call him on it, and the sheer awkwardness in the air meant they were going to change the subject. Oh, and 3. No one was going to believe Explosion's brat. That might be the funniest part of the whole situation. Thanks, he managed to croak out when his brother returned to his side. You didn't have to do it, but thanks. Of course I didn't, Niken. Izuku beamed up at him, adding a dumpling to Tamura's plate, and that was definitely his Yamakumo grin from the mall earlier, full of restrained malice just like Sensei's grins were. But I wanted to. And Lord forbid someone try and stop him from doing what he wanted. Tamura almost wondered if Izuku was actually just Sensei's clone, like in that one super old vigilante manga. The protagonist of that series had white hair, too, didn't he? Does anyone else have a problem with my brother being quirkless? Izuku asked the group at large, and between his fierce posture and the way they'd heard him speak to Bakugu a moment ago, not a single person spoke up. All right then. He went back to his second bowl of katsudon. Izuku's return from his very nice chat with Kaken saw the class collectively deciding to change the subject away from quirks, and their new guests in general, apparently. Whether they were truly disinterested in the newcomers or they were pretending out of embarrassment or fear. How delightful. Didn't really matter. Even after Kaken returned from his detour upstairs, wearing clean pants, he didn't confront Izuku or his family again, and just joined in discussion with Kaminari about a training exercise from the week. His mom kept getting up to fuss over All Might with Recovery Girl, who'd arrived with Ida about 10 minutes into the meal. Yagi-sensei had gone very neatly from a dead faint into a sound sleep, which was a bad sign in head trauma but apparently a very good thing in this case. The poor thing hasn't slept well recently. Hasn't slept well, with All for One breaking out of Tartarus 2 days ago and revealing his identity to All Might just yesterday? You don't say. Even more helpfully, Aizawa-sensei kept looking over at that group, which meant Izuku and Hisashi were out of his line of sight, so Izuku could grab Hisashi's hand under the table and periodically make several more copies of Decay to experiment with later. No offense to Tamura and he thought as he gleefully dusted just the clear varnish on his chopsticks, but he has no idea how versatile this quirk is. And the components. He could combine the building block that was Decay's 5-point activation with so many other quirk powers that wouldn't otherwise fit together. It was such a fantastic, all-purpose ability that he wondered how All for One had resisted the temptation over the years to just keep it. Or perhaps he had some long-term plan for acquiring Decay that Izuku's discovery of the duplication cheat had made obsolete, and Izuku had just spared Tamura from a terrible fate. Who could know? So lost in thought was he, that he startled to hear someone calling his name. He looked up from the last of the rice and vegetables he'd been shoveling into his mouth. Oh, dinner was over, and he was the only one still eating. You're taking all the leftovers, little brother, Tamura snickered from his right. And it was true, everyone seemed to have pushed all the serving dishes in his direction, and were watching him scarf them down like a black hole. Oops. Sorry, Izuku said through a mouthful of rice, shrinking in his seat. No, don't stop now, called Kaminari, distressed. We had a bet going. Izuku straightened. Well, if there's a bet, he supposed, and reached for the next dish. Demon, Izuku had scared these brats into SBMSN. Tamura watched them all start clearing the table, led by Engine Kid and the ponytail girl who'd commented on his suit, Yayarozu, while the purple-haired kid who definitely knew who Sensei was, but somehow hadn't figured out who Tamura was yet, had a timer app on his phone for whatever the bet about Izuku eating had been. Maybe how long it would take him to scarf down the last dish. Or just when he'd give up. Little did they know, Sensei ate a lot too. It was part of his quirk. Their quirk? Awakened a copy of All for One within One for All? Sure, Tamura wasn't completely buying into that explanation when the doctor had spent years on cloning, plenty of years for them to grow one of the clones to Izuku's age. These thoughts were promptly interrupted by the sound of a very familiar retro game starting in the next room over, where the TVs and consoles were. By the amused huff from Sensei and the muffled giggle from Izuku, his head had just whipped around like a startled cat's. Is that Smash? If it is, they'll be at it for hours, Purple Hair deadpanned. You'll get a turn eventually, when the first half of the group gives up. Come on, Tenko and I, Izuku said, setting his last empty plate down. 16 minutes, 43 seconds, the kid muttered, stopping his timer. Let's go upstairs. Tamura locked eyes with Dabi as he let himself be dragged away and sent him a hopeful look. The BS just smirked at him, before looking back over his little brother's shoulder at whatever ridiculous overpriced thing he was convincing him to buy. Ironic, considering Dabi normally kept his two outfits in an old plastic bag, and muttered endlessly about the noble suffering of the laborer and the moral depravity of the landowner. Anyway, Izuku led him down the upstairs hall to a nondescript door. Don't mind the decor in here, he grimaced before he opened it. Okay, I tried not to mind it, but what the F dash, this is creepy. Even conventions and merch shops didn't have this high a concentration of All Might merch. And all the figurines were turned to look right at the doorway. Extremely creepy. How do you sleep in here? Izuku? No, that expression was 100% Yamakumo, grinned at him. I usually don't. His eyes gleamed, manic, in the way of the sleep-deprived. Tamura resisted the urge to flinch away. All right then. Here, sit, I'm sure you have a lot of questions about all of this. Yamakumo sat on his bed, which was blessedly devoid of All Might print sheets or some other such madness, and gestured for Tamura to take the desk chair. It's fun, right? Tamura thought back to the past 2 hours of chaos. It's FNG great. You made Bakugu piss his pants. Yami snorted. I totally did, didn't I? He can't even look at you. Or me. No charisma, but that was a critical success on intimidation. Yep. Yami sprawled out over his bed. I'm probably gonna get questioned about the bullying thing later though, he added, speaking to the ceiling. That wasn't a lie. What the F dash? Really? Yeah. A grin, not as manic as the one from earlier had been. It actually looked a little sad. He told me to jump off a roof and hope for a quirk in my next life. Tamura went very still. How dare that brat? When? Same day I became All Might's successor, actually. Bruh. Ironic, I know. Yami plucked a pencil off his nightstand and expertly threw it point first into the ceiling, where Tamura now saw a sketch of overhaul had been taped up. There were holes in all the vital points. Right. Yamakumo was the one who took that a-hole down. It's like you're a shounen protagonist, Tamura muttered, grudgingly impressed. Sign in. Huh. He looked back at Yami, who definitely had a sad smile on his face now. The kid averted his eyes to the floor. It'll be a sign-in series, he elaborated, when it all comes crashing down. It's a villain story, Tamura. It's not allowed to end well. Downstairs, All Might bolted upright out of a dead sleep, with a look of utter certainty, and 2 terrified words in his mouth. Young Midoriya. So this is what goes on first? Shudo squinted at the fine print on the bottom of the label. Tuya turned it to the side with the medicinal directions. Apply generously to surface injuries, scars, and scabs. Yeah. Liquid bandage after if it's not a scar. You've got to let it sit for 20 minutes or so even if it isn't healing anything, otherwise the foundation rubs off. Tuya's whole makeup kit had been unpacked and laid out in the first-floor bathroom, after Shudo had admitted, during their online shopping spree that he was curious to see what he looked like without his scar. Since their skin tones matched, Tuya had been more than happy to show him the ropes. Not literal ropes, Otudo. He'd sighed at Shudo's immediate question, sounding pained but fond. The first layer tingled when it went on, even on the nerve-deadened skin of Shudo's scar, which had been startling. Faded. Just before the timer on his phone said they could apply foundation, which Tuya did for him on grounds of his expertise. He had, after all, just ordered a bunch of everything online, for future experimentation. Good thing you still have eyelashes on that side, Tuya observed, reaching for a makeup sponge. All my false lashes are white. I wouldn't have minded, Shudo promised. We could match. His brother hummed, moving on to highlighter. Comfortable silence descended as he applied it, and then eyeshadow, on both sides, not just the scarred side, this time. You'd really want to match with me? He asked eventually in a hushed voice. Shudo closed his eyes for the eyeliner. Of course I would, he murmured. You are still family. The pause. More than before, maybe. Has your Midoriya also adopted you? Tuya choked. Shudo opened his eyes to see him fumbling the eyeliner pencil, and sent out a thin curl of ice to catch the fragile-looking thing before it hit the floor. My Midoriya? He asked, strangled. Are you and Midoriya Tenko not in a queer platonic relationship? Shudo had thought he understood the signs correctly, from his classmates' explanations earlier in the year. You live together and seem to get along dash. Tuya shushed him with a hand in his face. Just, give me a second. He seemed to be, trying not to laugh. You think he dash? I apologize, said Shudo. You are just friends then? Yeah. Tuya regained control of himself. We were just friends. His father would kill me, wouldn't he? He muttered, then froze. Oh. Shudo, that reminds me, there's something dash. Todoroki the younger. Aizawa-sensei stuck his head in the bathroom. Todoroki the older. I need you to go check on Problem Child. They both turned to look at him. He flinched back a little in surprise. Sooner rather than later. Yes, sensei. Shudo stood up. Makeup's pretty much done anyway, Tuya shrugged. I can show you the extra stuff after. Problem Child is the green kid, right? Yes. Shudo led the way out of the bathroom and toward the stairs, which led them past the sofa where the Smash tournament was still going. Someone gasped and dropped their controller, and the game paused, to loud swearing by Baku. Todoroki, you look so different. Uraraka gasped. General agreement from the others. It's actually kind of weird, Kirishima blurted out. You're all symmetrical. Not a bad weird, he hastened to add, gesticulating wildly. Like, just different. You'd be pretty startled to see under my makeup too, said Tuya dryly. Come on, Shudo. Are you guys going upstairs? Asked Uraraka brightly. Deku's up there with his brother, isn't he? I've already pretty much lost, I'll join you. She stood up, handing her controller off to Kaminari. Ida also rose, and Yaoyorozu, and Ishido. Shudo considered whether Aizawa-sensei had wanted all of them to go upstairs, seeing as he had specifically asked him, but the man seemed too busy. In the living room, calming down a frantic All Might, for him to check. It was probably fine. It was not fine. Yadi dash, Shoyuta could not believe he was saying this. Get your sheet together, and sit the hell back down dash. All Might strained against the capture weapon, practically foaming at the mouth in his frantic attempts to get free and, Shoyuta assumed, dash upstairs. Scratch that, he was foaming at the mouth and it was blood. Was Problem Child's problemness contagious or was Todoroki's family spiracy not that far off the mark? His inner monologue cost him, as the skeletal man struggled free at last to stand shakily upright, still half draped in the capture weapon, of which Shoyuta had lost his grip. Problem Teacher, nickname in progress, sue him, was a scrappy BSTRD, lost muscle mass bedmed. Why young Midoriya? Yagi repeated, staggering toward the staircase as though possessed. Shoyuta looked over at Problem Parent, the nearest competent adult in the vicinity, he assumed. The man was leaned back in his chair at the kitchen table, watching the whole mess without lifting a finger. Help me with him, he mouthed at Midoriya Hisashi, before the students get involved. Recovery Girl was across campus at present, which made Midoriya the last option unless he was going to watch Ojiro wrestle Yagi back onto the couch. Fun mental image. Not worth embarrassing his reluctant coworker when he, hopefully, came back to his senses. So, problem parent. The man looked surprised. Genuinely surprised, not the manufactured expressions he'd been making most of the time. Jagged amusement was writ upon his face as he got up, staying carefully out of Yagi's line of sight, and raised 2 hands to sign, "Are you sure?" in flawless jizzle. Sho Yuta gritted his teeth, already doubting the wisdom of his decision even as he made it, and nodded. The grin that split Midoriya's face would have fit better on a great prowling cat. In an instant, the man had risen from his chair, and snuck up behind All Might in 3 long strides, seizing Yagi about the middle with one arm while the other covered his mouth. That's a bit excessive, Sho Yuta thought, except then problem parent let out a low laugh that froze Yagi and Sho Yuta both in place, and murmured something in his captive's ear that made the man thrash in a blind panic, a yell muffled behind Hisashi's hand, maybe not excessive, before his eyes rolled back in his head and he passed out. Thus incapacitated, he slumped in Midoriya's arms, and was swiftly lowered to the floor at his feet. Sho Yuta stared at the unconscious All Might. Then he stared at Midoriya. Speechless. "I did ask if you were sure," Hisashi pointed out. "Just help me put him back on the couch, please." Sho Yuta bent to retrieve his capture weapon from the floor. When he stood up, he found that Hisashi had arranged the sleeping All Might's limbs to lay him out like a corpse in a Western funeral service. Then he crouched down next to him and took a peace sign. Selfie, smirking. "Thanks, problem parent." The door to Midoriya's room was ajar. Approaching, the group could hear their friend's characteristic muttering and the sound of pages turning, before Midoriya must have heard their footsteps. "You guys can come in." Ashido shrieked when she saw all the All Might figurines, which startled a laugh out of Izuku and his brother both. "You have those set up on purpose," she accused, smiling now. "Nice one, Mido. What are you guys up to in here?" Uraraka stood on her tiptoes, peering around the room. "Oh, I've never seen those trophies before. Did you always have them?" "What, these?" Izuku's cheeks were going pink. Yeah, they're pretty old. I keep them with my older notebooks in a safe. Do you want to see?" He held up the 2 small trophies with tendrils of black whip. Musudafu Community Center, both red at the top, juried piano recitals, 4th place, read 1, and juried violin recitals, 3rd place, read the other. They were both from the same year, about 2 years ago. "You play violin and piano?" Yaoyorozu stated the obvious, surprised. "Well, it was a hobby before my quirk came in," he admitted, sheepish. "I mostly just compose nowadays, there's software dash." "Because of your hand injuries?" Shudo stated bluntly from the back of the group, which had everyone pretending not to look at the hands in question except, "Oh my gosh, do you your hands? They're better." A dozen eyes all turned as one to stare. Izuku cringed under the weight of their attention, blabbering excuses. "Yeah, I think it's, another Black Whip situation. I woke up and..." Izuku gestured with his hands and shrugged. Don't tell Recovery Girl yet. I want to make sure it doesn't change back next time I sleep." She already went back to her office. Tuya contributed from the doorway. "You know what this means?" Yaoyorozu went to the door, squeezing past Tuya. "You can play the violin again. I have one in my room you can try." The strained smile on Izuku's face, the resigned look in his eyes, was totally worth the sheer ridiculousness of this whole place, Tuya thought. All for one perked up a bit in the armchair Aizu's teacher had pointed him towards, as the telepathic message quirk he'd given Aizu earlier activated. "Dad," it began, "how amusing that Aizu would actually assign him that title. I'm getting more questions about the healing than we anticipated. I don't know if I can pretend it's a spontaneous quirk." "Lucky, then, that I came up with an even better cover story just now," Hisashi replied, watching a faint mist rise off of All Might's sleeping form. Giddy anticipation tickled him. He steepled his fingers in front of his face and waited, sensing the group of students coming down again from upstairs. See, it was stuff like this that was why he was glad he'd gone to Aizu first. Nowhere else could he have this much fun just bullshitting in plain sight. 1A unofficial official Discord, hashtag smash posting. 7:48 p.m. Current scoreboard. At Bakugu, 5, idle. The Kaminari, 3. The Zero, 3. At Kirishima, 2. At Uraraka, 2, idle. At Ishido, 2, idle. At Ida, 1, idle. Next round in 60 seconds. 7:48 p.m. Ishido. Okay, but we're all in agreement the dude's a total weirdo. 7:48 p.m. Uraraka. He's Aries' uncle, and Midoriya doesn't trust him? 7:49 p.m. Kirishima. Namito trusts his dad, or he wouldn't be playing along his shenanigans. But yes, total weirdo. 7:49 p.m. Ishido. Todoroki's Brodoroki was staring at Papadoria all dinner. 7:49 p.m. Jiru. Yeah, but that's his father-in-law. 7:50 p.m. Ishido. All fair, but still. I think he knows SMH about Papadoria that we don't. If Mito knows. 7:50 p.m. Kaminari. Even if he somehow didn't before now, he's gotta by now, like asked the dude has rancid vibes. Thank you, Hitoshi wanted to say, thumbs poised over his screen to type it where he sat against the wall in the kitchen, half listening to the Smash tournament, except he knew better. Motion at the fringes of his field of view. Midoriya's father sat back down in his chair, smiling at nothing. It set Hitoshi on edge. His fight-flight-freeze response was stuck halfway between flight and freeze, again. The way it had the last time he'd seen that man. I believe I knew your parents, a small satisfied smile that sent chills down his spine, because his parents had been, no, please, we'll do anything dash. Our son, you can take his, it's useful dash. YA dash. The forward of the sink cupboard against his back, his shoulders, the smell of disinfectant so strong in his nose that his eyes watered, hearing his heartbeat so loud in his chest, louder than the shallow breaths he fought not to take. The cupboard door thrown open, a face, the top half shadowed, but the teeth were so white it was all Hitoshi could see, and the smell of blood stronger than the disinfectant in the air that was coming in. There had been the softest psionic ping of a telepathy quirk in the moment that lapsed between Hitoshi's quiet question and Midoriya Hisashi's spoken answer. A quirk Hitoshi recognized all too well. Hello, child, spoke the monster, broad pale hand offered to help him out of the cupboard. It is heartening to see you well, child, and then aloud, it's nice to see what good friends there are, for my son. Hitoshi knew why he knew this man. He flinched from the hand that reached for him, staggered to his feet and flung himself through the doorway to the sitting room. The monster stood and watched, did not stop him, didn't have to, not when he chanced to look back in the direction he was running from and tripped over something, fell on his side into a wet puddle and opened his eyes to meet bright purple irises staring glassy out of his mother's face. Hitoshi screamed, rolled onto his back and sat up, heedless of the still warm puddle of something soaking into his shirt, and the man was there, watching him from the doorway. Amused. Are you going to kill me? He had to ask, desperately wishing he could focus enough to use his quirk, but the monster had succeeded where his parents never could, had terrified it out of his grasp. No, Hitoshi-kun. The monster spoke with his mother's telepathy. I have only set you free. And Hitoshi had seen the flicker of apprehension in Midoriya's eyes earlier, when he saw that Hitoshi recognized him. The way his grip on his father's wrist had shifted into a restraining hold. The almost apologetic grimace that crossed his face for a moment, before his expression had gone carefully blank. Midoriya knew what the monster was. So was Midoriya Hisashi really his father, or did Hitoshi's classmate know him the same way Hitoshi did? 7:50 p.m. Ishido at Kaminari. Aren't you playing this round? 7:50 p.m. Kaminari. I couldn't resist the notification sound. Who cares about winning? 7:51 p.m. Current scoreboard. At Bakugu, 5, idle. The Zero. The Kaminari, 3. At Kirishima, 2. At Uraraka, 2, idle. At Ishido, 2, idle. At Ida, 1, idle. Next round in 60 seconds. 7:51 p.m. Kaminari. Ow, I look away for 10 seconds. 7:51 p.m. Deku. Dunce face, you're sabotaging my spot on the scoreboard. 7:52 p.m. Ishido, he's not even playing though? 7:52 p.m. Bakugo, he's letting Siro win. Which is worse? 7:53 p.m. Bakugo, also WTF are you extras doing upstairs at Ishido? 7:53 p.m. Ishido at everyone clear the room, Deku's gonna do a performance. Several people are typing. Yaoyorozu Momo's education prior to UA had not included combat training like Todoroki's had, much to her chagrin, with how much she'd needed to catch up, but it was by no means lacking. She had had private tutors in a dozen subjects, from chemistry, the most pertinent matter to her quirk, to dance, from economics to elocution, from philosophy to law. For a well-rounded background, so that she would not be limited to only one career, and to that end, the arts and music had been just as compulsory. Momo at 8 had had her pick of instruments, and she had chosen the violin, at first, she would admit, because the protagonist of her favorite book series could play it, and then because it turned out to be a different challenge than mastering her quirk, refreshingly separate from school. Love of the instrument as an art form came easily at the instruction of her soon-to-be favorite tutor, Suzuki Mei. Some 75 years old and mostly retired even when they first met, Suzuki-sensei was a fountain of information about the world, and easily the kindest person Momo had ever met. Suzuki-sensei was also Momo's first introduction to volunteer work. She spent half her week offering violin lessons to other children at the Mizudafu Public Library, of all ages, who would have never been able to afford such studies otherwise. It was Suzuki-sensei's proudest achievement, she told a young and impressionable Momo, and was happy to continue telling Momo about it. Whenever she asked, which was often, since the crop of students her tutor spoke about were rarely there for more than a few months at a time. It would be some time before Momo realized this instability was because they were largely children in the foster system, one institution of many that she hoped to reform in her capacity as a hero. After almost a decade, Suzuki-sensei was secured in her position as a close family friend. Her number was one of the top 3 recent contacts in Momo's phone, ever a confidant as she made her way through the rigorous UA curriculum not unlike Suzuki-sensei's own past conservatory studies, and as Momo followed Midoriya downstairs in his, well, posse, she wondered if her tutor would recognize her classmate from a photo. I am really not that good, you guys, and I've been out of practice for ages. Midoriya was bashfully insisting even as he let himself be herded downstairs, but the fancy musician's tailcoat Ishido had found in the back of his closet had fit well enough to still be new. So maybe it was nosy of her, but Momo snapped a quick photo and sent it to Suzuki-sensei. By any chance, she asked her tutor, is this him? The shy but brilliant charity student her sensei had said was on a whole other level from everyone else. The prodigy. Or he would have been, Suzuki-sensei's soft musical laugh, but he avoided the limelight like it would give him a sunburn, the poor dear. Why, I bet he'd have told me he didn't win first place, if I hadn't been there to see it myself. The trophies upstairs had been much too large for just third and fourth place. Izuku would have asked, blame a history of social isolation for how easily he caved to peer pressure from his friends. He wished he didn't, because he would have preferred to refuse, no matter the beautiful violin Yaoyorozu had presented him with, and the high-end keyboard Jairu had nabbed from her room when he'd mentioned composing for piano as well. It was too late by then anyway, he supposed. He'd already fueled up the hype train. Maybe, he told himself, vaguely optimistic, it won't be as interesting to everybody else. Maybe they'll just let me play something outdoors and stick to the Smash tournament. Then, everyone else crowded in ahead of him with the instruments into the room that had previously held the TV and sofa, and was now rearranged into a tiny concert space, where most of the class and guests were already seated to await his performance. Oh, hell, he thought, staring on in dread from the doorway. Even as some small part of him, also thrilled at the others' collective enthusiasm, was nervously excited to show off, the same part of him that had taken such pride in this ability in the first place. The part of him he attributed entirely to all for one's influence. Since everyone seems to want me to, he fought the urge to cringe under the weight of the attention, I guess I can play through the pieces I remember the best? Someone, Kaminari? Cheered, and Izuku felt his cheeks warming, but closed his eyes, and settled into the first song he could think of. One that was easy to play but still sounded cool while he got used to having working hands again. No charisma, but, thought Tamura from the back corner of the impromptu concert seating, now he's rolling a performance check? And that was a natural 20 if he ever heard one. Holy shit, what was Yamakumo? Was he for real? Tamura was not the only one whose jaw had dropped the moment the kid started playing. The absolute stereotype of a supervillain, right here. All they needed was ominous red lighting and maybe a creepy cathedral background, if the producers were trying to be really blatant. Tamura might be a little envious. It wasn't like he could learn an instrument, decay being the quirk that it was. Maybe if he had the dedication to learn digital composition, or the patience for a theremin, but that thing sounded too weird even for him. He texted Dobby, because there was no one else to text, and because it was quieter than talking. You seeing this bullshit? I'm literally sitting next to you, the BSD replied. So yes. A moment later, it's ridiculous. I could learn an instrument, Dobby's kid brother suggested from one seat over, having evidently read their conversation over Dobby's shoulder. So much for privacy. If you and your roommate, what was that pause? Tamura wanted to ask, what are you trying to imply? Want to what? Tamura almost asked, start a band? But then he realized Yamakumo had finished the current piece, and amidst polite applause, was talking to Sensei where the man sat by one wall. And it's a duet piece, violin and piano, he was saying, and Sensei had immediately straightened up in his seat like the kid had dangled a shiny object in front of him. So, do you want to join in? All for one beamed at Yamakumo, not the villainous grin Sensei and Tamura shared, but a smile that went beyond sunny to blindingly bright. Tamura's stomach twisted to see the alleged resemblance between the two of them made that much more overt. I'd love to, Sensei told Yamakumo, standing up. No, should'o, Dobby grumbled under his breath while Yamakumo passed Sensei a print of some sheet music and they moved the instruments around a little. I am not envious of their healthy family dynamic. But ding, Tamura thought, watching Yamakumo explain some detail of the sheet music to All for One, I kind of am. The rest of that train of thought was thankfully interrupted by the kid addressing the audience again. So, like Momo might have said, he smiled anxiously, I compose music sometimes for fun. Back when I last could. Sometimes, put it pretty dim and lightly, Tamura had seen the folder on Mikumo's computer with all his digital compositions. And I never completely stopped after? But the best digital software still can't compete with actually playing an instrument, much less an orchestra, so I'm going to have to test most of these later. Mikumo smiled to himself, a smile Tamura once thought exclusive to Sensei, the grin he wore when getting to monologue about his plans for the future. Of course, with Sensei those plans were crimes against humanity, but the sentiment was the same. Anyway, the point, I guess, is I usually compose things after watching hero fights, so it's not special, he emphasized. But it is a bit morbid? The kid with the bird head perked up. Do tell, Midoriya, what great struggle of good and evil kindled this flame in your artist's heart? What a Chuyuni, Dobby murmured to Tamura. Yamakumo grinned, and hit the light switches with a tendril of his quirk, so that only the light over his head remained. Into the quiet anticipation of the darkened room, he answered, The Battle of Kamino. Suzuki-sensei 2012. My goodness, what a small world we live in. Yes, I do believe that is my little prodigy. Momo bit back a gasp, and started the sound recording app on her phone. The Battle of Kamino, if that was what the piece was called, opened with piano, a slow melody almost enough to lull the listener into comfort, except it was in the minor key. It rose goosebumps on Momo's arms instead, a thread of unease that matched the composition's ominous name. She felt her pulse slow to match it, breathing deepen. The simplicity of the part worked for what she could imagine as the first glimpse of the destruction of Kamino Ward, a bystander's astonished look over the flattened rubble landscape. The dim overhead lighting was just enough to capture Midoriya's intensely focused expression as he raised his bow, breathed in, and began his part. And if Momo had had any doubt that Midoriya was, indeed, the prodigy her tutor had spoken about over the years, even after confirmation in text, it was blown away like the shockwave of her classmates' quirk-powered strikes. as he dragged sounds off the instrument that she did not think she'd ever heard. The effort it took, the strength, the skill, to make a violin sound like this, to render from inanimate wood and fiber the mournful operatics of a wailing, living voice? Momo's heart pounded so loudly under the pressure of that villain, whose presence had so dominated the battlefield even on film, and was wrought anew from sound alone. She could feel the despair of the onlooker, the dread of the figure that had stood against All Might as an insurmountable foe, formed out of nightmare and shadow, like Midoriya was now. The piano drifted through its slow melody, still, as chills ghosted through the audience, and seamlessly flowed into a softer, happier melody that passed by the ear like a fleeting fairy's dream. The difference only made it harsher than when Midoriya returned to how he had begun. A demonstration, a promise, of futility in the face of death, and then quieter, contemplative, for a final call into the void, before it was done. Then there was only them, the audience, and the heavy silence of the room. A moment later, like everyone had planned it, there was applause. Wow, thought Hitoshi dazedly, applauding almost unconsciously. Holy shit, they are not subtle. He glanced at Aizawa, who had raised just one eyebrow but was clapping dutifully all the same, beside present Mike, who looked genuinely stunned. Midoriya may as well have titled that, "My Father's Villain Theme." Because that was what it sounded like, to him. There was muttering from the back of the rows of chairs, where Todoroki was sitting with his brother and his brother's roommate, but he couldn't quite make it out at this distance. Hitoshi turned and looked upon a terrified All Might, gazing at the Midoriyas from the doorway like they were a falling meteor, come to end the world. Wait, Hitoshi blurted out louder than he meant to, "You've reinflated?" The minute he looked over to All for One and caught the gleam in his eye, Izuku should have guessed he'd been up to something. Indeed, as soon as he'd noticed the faint cool mist seeping in through the doorway to the next room, he should have extrapolated based on the current occupants of the dorms and their last known locations, and put the pieces together. But Izuku had allowed himself to act his age, for once, and indulge in the joy of the performance, to direct all his focus into a few minutes of meticulous, intensive bowing on his borrowed violin, for a motivation as simple as impressing his friends. So a regenerated All Might bursting into the room and stopping dead in the doorway to stare slack-jawed up at them, with undisguised terror in his eyes? Yeah. Izuku hadn't expected any of that. "Wait," Hitoshi blurted out, "you've reinflated?" "Thanks, Shinso," Izuku thought as the room descended into chaos, "for that hilarious mental image." Shoyuta was about 5 seconds away from just giving up on everything and moving to Korea. He stared, with the utter weariness of a triage nurse in a war zone, first at All Might, who looked at least 10 years younger and mysteriously not withered, then, across the diorama of total bedlam that was the living room, at Midoriya Hisashi. A man who, within hours of meeting him, had already earned and lived up to the nickname of Problem Parent, who was, indeed, at this very moment locked in eye contact with All Might and smirking like the worst, most spoiled cat. As the uproar reached fever pitch, something in Aizawa Shoyuta simply snapped, and he did something that, to those who knew him, was quite out of character. He yelled, at the top of his lungs, a volume rivaling present mix when he wasn't using his quirk. "Everyone be quiet." So shocked were they, and so well trained from being his students, that 1A fell silent within seconds. Problem Parent and Problem Teacher, had not been speaking, but both of their heads whipped around to look at him. Shoyuta took a moment to catch his breath, as he had just used up all his air, and turned to address Midoriya Hisashi. As did the audience. "What," he ground out, "have you done?" Problem Parent, unlike Problem Child, did not so much as wince beneath the force of his glare. Shoyuta was unsurprised by this, but secretly a little disappointed. "Well, you see," he began smoothly after a moment, "my quirk is a little more versatile, so to speak, than just fire breath." Shoyuta stared. "I can breathe fire, but it isn't so much an emitter quirk as the product of a stockpile." All Might twitched. "What I have is more accurately described as," Hisashi's mouth quirked in thought, "a fire elemental healing quirk, I suppose." "That would explain a lot, wouldn't it?" Underworld connections only made sense for someone with a healing quirk that could not only accomplish, well, that, but also let its user breathe fire, one of the flashiest combat abilities. The man would have found himself sought after by both sides of the law, and to be honest, the Yakuza did pay better. Shoyuta himself had been scouted numerous times before he went to you. He would know, and what was it Midoriya-san had said about her husband having a drag habit? Yeah, he could incorporate this into his worldview. Then it rang out, a single word. Bullshit. Every head turned to the source of the outburst, because Todoroki Shudo had never before spoken with such passion. Or sworn. What? Someone whispered, and the boy glanced in their direction. I said bullshit. There is no such thing as a fire elemental healing quirk. Shudo's eyes were narrowed, glaring with surprising anger at Midoriya's father. I do not believe you. Hanzi, OKWTF. How is your brother of all people the one who saw through that? Dabi, I think he's only gullible to a point, and he finally snapped. Dabi had been trying and failing to get his kid brother to sit down and not call out the ruler of the underworld on a flimsy lie this entire time, but he simply wasn't very strong, so it just looked like he was holding Shudo's hand. He hoped it didn't come across as supportive. Obviously there is such a quirk, All for One was replying, one eyebrow arched, because I've just used it. Twice, in fact. He gestured to his son, who held up his hands with an expression of muted surprise. Right? He'd totally mangled them a while ago, hadn't he? Dabi kind of remembered that from the explanation of why this violin thing was such a big deal. Dabi's kid brother, who had no idea who he was dealing with, kept talking. Allow me to clarify, I do not believe the quirk exists naturally. This had considering looks being sent his way by All Might, and oh, right, that guy has totally fought All for One like multiple times. He absolutely knew what was up. Midoriya's father was doing a shockingly good job of playing dumb. So you're saying I'm, some kind of science experiment? And the son was too. Shudo-kun, he groaned, my father is not a Numu. Dabi's brother was undeterred. Midoriya's original explanation of your quirk was too accurate to be so easily disbelieved. I posit that his hypothesis, ignition of a liquid stored in the throat to produce fire breath, is correct. Or rather, that it was until you left Japan and came back. Shudo's eyes narrowed at Midoriya Hisashi. He pointed at him. Which Dabi wished he wouldn't do, because what if he lost that hand? You used your connections with the underworld to meet the supervillain known as All for One, and bought yourself a designer quirk. Just as, he pointed at Midoriya, now, you did for Izuku. Oh, sheet, Dabi thought, that was actually pretty good. What? Shudo, no, my quirk isn't bought dash. All for One crossed his arms, managing to affect complete skepticism without even needing to speak. You do realize that only sounds reasonable because you've made multiple major assumptions in the process? But am I wrong? Shudo demanded. Dabi really wanted to get out of here. It's inherited. Midoriya blurted out, then clapped his hands over his mouth like he hadn't meant to say it. Okay, what now? It's inherited. The room had gone quiet again, quieter than it had already gotten so that everyone could watch the back and forth between Shudo and All for One, and they were once more all staring at him. Izuku wanted nothing more than to take back his words, because in the instant that had passed since they'd left his mouth, he had predicted how the next hour was going to go. My quirk is actually All Might's, he'd begin, and then have to re-emphasize that no, Shudo, he's not my dad is right here. But, more than that, more than any of it, the secrets of his private life, the secrets of One for All, they were his secrets. And he wanted to keep it that way. Dad, the whisper urgent in his mind's ears, with nary a twitch to indicate the quirk being directed at him, All for One suppressed a grin at Yamakumo's utter competence with subterfuge. Please tell me there's a quirk to make people forget the last couple of minutes? He reached out and ruffled his son's hair. Hitoshi's eyelid twitched involuntarily. The ridiculous dramatic tension of this whole evening was starting to get to him. He caught the eye of Todoroki's older brother from across the room, commiserating with the nervous look he had about him, as if to say, yes. I, too, am terrified that Todoroki Shudo is calling out the symbol of evil on his flimsy lies. A symbol of evil who was, presently recrossing his arms and giving Shudo the most doubtful look Hitoshi had ever seen. You do realize that only sounds reasonable because you've made multiple major assumptions in the process? But am I wrong? Todoroki insisted, and the words pinged Hitoshi's brain like he'd just heard this exact conversation before, perhaps the strongest sense of déjà vu that he could remember experiencing. He shivered, trying to shake off the feeling, and looked to Midoriya, who was combing a hand through his hair in an absent gesture and glancing between his father and his classmate. Hitoshi watched him take a deep breath, and then interrupt the back and forth with a loud sigh. Yes, he said simply, you are wrong. I haven't seen Dad since I was 11, Shudo. Obviously he didn't tell me because it was none of Kidmi's business. That I suppose. Shudo seemed to deflate a little in disappointment, while his brother, Hitoshi saw, deflated in clear relief. All for one spoke up again before the boy could get any new ideas. Now that we've got that clarified, he drawled, may I suggest that Yagi-san be escorted to the medical center on campus so we can be sure he's fully healed? I'd prefer to sleep easily tonight if you don't mind. With surprisingly little fussing from everyone besides the reluctant to leave All Might, the sort of party broke up after that. Izuku helped move the furniture back into place, stifling a yawn behind his hand, and pretended like it was fatigue from the day, and not him coming down from the high of having avoided the consequences of his actions. He'd caught Hitoshi staring at him several times in the time since the memory wipe quirk activated. I call it blackout, All for one had murmured in his mind after, an area of effect quirk that targets everyone besides the user and whoever the user is touching. It has a 6-month cooldown, so use your copy wisely. Izuku couldn't be sure whether Hitoshi's own mental quirk had interfered with the activation, or if it was just his friend's continued unease of knowing who Hisashi was, but the longer he went without confronting him, the less he decided he was worried about it. Aizawa had shown Hisashi, Tamura, Dabi, and Inko to the family apartments not long after All Might was cajoled into seeing Recovery Girl again, and most of 1A were going to bed, so when Izuku finished rearranging the sofas and TV in the living room, he decided to do the same. And it was then, with his eyes closing almost as soon as he'd snuggled into his pile of multicolored blankets, that Izuku realized what consequences he hadn't managed to avoid. Hi there, Ninth. Banjo gestured sharply at a plastic folding chair in the void, surrounded by 7 rather imposing thrones. How about you take a seat? No idea how that quirk works, but you're in peak condition, Recovery Girl informed Yagi with disbelieving raised eyebrows. Congratulations. The man who had never looked more like the #1 hero in the entire time Shoyuta had known him, slumped over with his head in his hands in a very un-All Might way. Yagi announced. I can't believe this. Oh, quit your complaining, Chio whacked him on the shoulder with her cane. It produced a much more solid thud than it used to. You know how many people would kill for that kind of restoration? Doesn't matter, Yagi grumbled, flopping back onto the bed. With one for all passed on, it isn't like I'm going back into the industry. Hell, they couldn't pay me to go back. To that paperwork, he added under his breath, except with his restored lungs it was actually at speaking volume. And we have much bigger problems. Shoyuta eyed him from where he was leaning against the wall, for coolness. Spill. Piercing blue eyes gleamed at him. Midoriya Hisashi, Yagi said. The one who just healed you? Chio scoffed. The very same. Yagi sat up again, and leveled them both with a hard stare. Because these are not the effects of a healing quirk. The pause. Technically they are, but not the way you'd expect. Shoyuta raised an eyebrow. And here I thought you would start with him obviously financing the Yakuza. I wouldn't be surprised if he was. Yagi crossed his arms, leaning back against the wall. Another thing in a long list of his crimes. Out with it, Recovery Girl nudged him with the end of her cane. It's midnight, I want to go to bed. Young Midoriya's father, All Might declared, is all for one. The extra apartments for UA guests were attached to Heights Alliance by a hallway on the ground floor, with an extra door in between them and the dorms. This was no consolation, not when one knew the real enemy was in their midst. Knowing this, knowing that Japan's most powerful, most frightening supervillain, who no one had yet truly beaten, was less than 30 meters away, and knew where he slept, did not a restful night's sleep make. Or so Hitoshi had thought, but he'd still managed a little of it. He jerked awake at the sound of a knock on his door. Oh shit, Hitoshi thought, adrenaline jarring him into high gear. Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, all for one was here to kill him, or steal brainwash and make him kill someone, or worse. It took him a few seconds to realize it hadn't been his door, but one nearby. He was only marginally calmed down by the time he recognized Bakugo speaking, by which point he'd already stepped out into the hallway himself. Yo, icy hot, Bakugo was hissing at Todoroki's dorm room door, beyond which, now that Hitoshi was in the hallway, he could hear people inside. Let me in, we gotta talk. Todoroki opened it, peering at Bakugo, and then at Hitoshi, which was when Bakugo noticed him standing behind him. Hitoshi saw him twitch. It was a great effort not to smile. Come in then, he told them and stepped back. Inside, they found Todoroki Tuya, a rolling whiteboard, and a wall absolutely covered in paper, photos, drawings, diagrams, and notes, pinned on what looked like corkboard. Welcome to hell, Tuya drawled, sprawling out on 3 beanbags. I've been using TNII as a sounding board for my new ideas, Todoroki explained. He reached into the outlet tray of his printer and pinned up a new photo on the conspiracy wall, Midoriya and his father, standing side by side. 3 hours of this, Tuya yawned. And let me guess, you're here for the same reason? To talk about Greeny's old man? Like I told TNII, Izuku's father is giving extremely bad vibes. Todoroki nodded, pointing at another photo of Midoriya Hisashi that had ominous black squiggly lines drawn on in permanent marker. Between that and his Yakuza connections, a piece of paper that read, Shai Hasaikai collaborator? I believe he may be an international financial criminal. Hitoshi saw Tuya twitch and knew that he knew. This was something. Well, have I got news for you, half and half, that's not Deku's dad. Bakugo glanced at the door. Shivered. Glanced back at the rest of them. Midoriya Hisashi, the real one? He was an a-hole. Todoroki's eyes brightened. Oh. Yeah. He was an abusive piece of shit. Bakugo's expression twisted. He stared past them at the wall. Fucker liked burning Deku with his quirk. Behind him, the Todoroki brothers exchanged startled looks. But this guy, Bakugo went on, jabbing his finger across the room at the photo of Midoriya Hisashi with the bad vibes lines, he treats Deku like a son. Fucking cares about him. He has a similar quirk as the real Hisashi, Todoroki considered. Yeah, but it's not the same, Bakugo snapped. It's like a copy, or something. He stood up suddenly, going several shades paler. Wait a f***ing second. Hitoshi watched Bakugo snatch a black marker off Todoroki's desk and start drawing over the face on the bad vibes photo. His classmate's breathing came faster as he staggered back, typing something into a search function on his phone. It's not a similar quirk. Bakugo turned to them, ashen, holding his phone up next to the photo on the wall. On it, a screenshot from a video of the Battle of Kamino. On the wall, Midoriya Hisashi's face had been drawn over with the Kamino villain's helmet. They looked nearly identical. It's him, he whispered. All for one. Yeah, we know, said Hitoshi and Tuya at the same time. Explain, Ninth, Banjo demanded, lightning in his eyes, how exactly it is you know that man. Izuku took a fortifying breath, looking up at all the other vestiges from his uncomfortable plastic seat. They were all staring back. He read suspicion, anger, concern, even fear in some of their eyes. Of the 7, only First was looking at him without any distrust, and that was because his expression lacked any emotional cues at all. When I was 10, he began, and the mist of their realm surged up to fill the whole space with what Izuku recognized as the start of a vestige memory. His memory. The scene opened with a door closing. Izuku stared at it as the solid thud of it against the frame and the metal click of the lock resounded in the front room of his family's once apartment, almost echoing in the silence left behind. It had been years since he saw this door, worn at the edges with off-color fresh paint on the dents and scratches too often left against the wood, yet he fell into the memory as though no time had passed at all, staring at the doorknob in the light from the street lamps outside. Because his father had turned all the lights off before he left. As if Izuku didn't live there, too. Frowning, he went to the window to watch him go. A nondescript man in an ill-fitting, wrinkled suit, off to get drunk for at least the next 2 nights. Izuku knew, without having to check, that the fridge and the kitchen cabinets would be empty. "You're going out?" Fifth asked as he, or his memory self, retrieved a worn backpack from his bedroom and packed clothes and toiletries inside. An empty plastic bottle, one that Izuku must have refilled 100 times in its lifespan, was laid carefully on top, before he dressed in street clothes and put his sneakers on. "Of course I am," Izuku answered, drifting as the memory progressed. Him sneaking out the window, spare key on a twine necklace under his shirt, and slinking off in the opposite direction as Midoriya Hisashi had gone, toward the library where the public computers were. The BSTERI emptied all the food in the house. If I wanted to eat, then I needed to leave and find some. That wasn't the priority yet, though. Memory Izuku walked into the library, murmured a greeting to the night shift librarians, and plugged a flash drive into a computer in the furthest corner of the room full of them, opening a communications program in a tiny window of the screen while the Hero Forums took up the rest of it. While Yamikumo logged into the Hero Forums and played the latest video of a new hero in Osaka, Izuku typed a string of letters and numbers into the black command prompt window of the other program, one that Izuku recognized as a private key. He submitted the sequence, and it opened into a barebones email inbox, with just one new message. An address. Oh, Izuku thought. It's the memory of that day. He could feel the Vestige's eyes on him during the first meeting with the middleman, and, indirectly, all for one. "No wonder you caught his eye," First said after. "But why did you want to meet with him, anyway?" Izuku stared at him. "What do you mean?" But the longer he thought about it, the more he realized. They didn't know. The Vestiges didn't get instantaneous access to all his thoughts and memories. The only way they knew about things was by observing them. And Izuku had never talked about his past to anyone. "Oh," he said aloud. "I think it's easier if I just skip ahead to when I tell him." With a great exertion of will, he wrenched the memories forward, until when Akitani Mikumo walked through a warp gate into a nondescript meeting room with no windows, face to helmeted face with all for one. To contract out a hit on this man. Izuku watched the Vestiges watch the memory, saw the many expressions that crossed their faces as his younger self bared scars that the original Hisashi had given him, scars that Izuku no longer had, and offered up his quirk in the process. First, in particular, seemed the most affected by it. He had hidden his mouth behind his hand, a certain choked look to the visible parts of his face. But the end of that meeting, none of the Vestiges appeared to be judging Izuku for meeting with all for one. "It does still beg the question, though," Fifth murmured, "of why he's following you around now." "You're right," First said. "It's not like him. Lots of people hired all for one to murder their enemies, and you aren't the first to hire him to kill your abuser." He drifted closer, pinning Izuku with a calculating eye. "You did something that impressed him, didn't you?" Before Izuku could answer, the memories changed scenes again. Several years ago, Izuku twitched awake at the buzz of his phone under his pillow, 3:15. He thumbed the alarm off and slid soundlessly out of bed, into the stillness of the silent night air. It was the work of minutes to change into the plain clothes he'd prepared hours earlier, to comb his hair back with gel and hide it under a knit cap. A bag, similarly readied well ahead of time, sat by the bedside table. His phone, now on silent, received a notification. 1 minute later, he stepped into the portal that opened in front of him. For the first time that night, Izuku felt himself pale. He could have told First that he'd done some quirk analysis, or helped hunt down one of all for one's enemies, or something. They didn't need to see this. The portal opened this time onto a warehouse, quiet and empty. An unseasonably cool breeze stirred up dust from the concrete floors, bringing with it the smells of old lumber, rust, damp, and the particular odor of fresh asphalt. Urban decay. It could be anywhere, really. Izuku didn't know and didn't care. His gaze was drawn to the only source of light in the dark, the old industrial lamps that were propped up in the center of the room, a pool of sodium gold atop thick plastic sheeting, and the subject of the scene, the chair, bolted to the ground, and the man seated in it, bound in glittering chains. "Welcome, Yamikumo," said a low voice from the shadowed periphery, a voice Izuku recognized now as Kurojiri. "My lord will be here momentarily. The target has been sedated. Please confirm his identity." The Izuku in the memory took in the features of Midoriya Hisashi, slumped to the side as much as the chains would allow. Replace had not changed his memories, it seemed, but even if it had, he could have recognized him just from the cloud of stale alcohol fumes that emanated from the unconscious body. "It's him," Izuku said to the empty air. "Good," smiled another voice, emerging from the dark. He turned around. "Hello, all for one Sama." The supervillain, black helmet gleaming in the oblique lights, laid a companionable hand on Izuku's shoulder. Izuku still remembered the weight of it somehow. "Hello, Mikumo-kun." Unbeknownst to the vestiges and Izuku, there was another witness to the replay of this memory. All for one had thought himself merely dreaming at first, a novelty after the heavy sedatives of Tartarus, and even before that, the pain-mitigating drags and quirks that had limited his time asleep. He had opened his eyes to mist and shadow, and a distant circle of light where something like a film was playing. Only when he'd drawn nearer did he recognize the scene, and silhouetted against the dream's vague borders, the other members of the audience. Intrigued as he was, he kept back, to watch in silence. "He's still alive, of course," the all for one of the past promised with a hidden smile. Mikumo-kun nodded. "I expected as much. I wanted to see him die." "Good." It was good. Never trust blindly that a task has been done, he'd always told Tamura, and Tamura had never grasped it as intuitively as Mikumo had. All for one remembered thinking this then, proud of the boy, as with a gravity bordering on ceremony, his counterpart laid a curved blade in Mikumo's palm. "Here," he murmured, curling Mikumo's fingers around the knife handle. "Go ahead." "Oh," first breathed. "I see." Izuku swallowed, hands clenched in his lap. You have to understand, he had to die, or he was going to kill me first." But his words may as well have been swallowed in the mist, for all that any of the vestiges seemed to hear them. All eyes remained fixed on the Izuku in the scene. The 11-year-old Mikumo was glancing between All for One's helmet and the knife, the polite smile shaky on his face. "You want me to do it?" he asked. "You couldn't just kill him yourself and let me watch?" "I could," All for One mouthed along with his counterpart, "but this is a gift." A gift," Mikumo repeated, uncertain. "Closure," the villain elaborated. "More than revenge. The certainty that it is truly done. The satisfaction of knowing," he added lower, "that you have defeated him. That this enemy has no hold over you anymore." He hadn't expected the boy to understand. Even the most intelligent people often needed convincing when it came to compromising their morals. Garaki, at first, had been the same way. All for one remembered looking forward to convincing Mikumo, when he'd planned out this confrontation ahead of time. But Midoriya Izuku only nodded, silent, and turned to the bound figure, adjusting his grip on the knife. All for one had kept Midoriya Hisashi sedated using one of his quirks, when he was done with him. Now, he let awareness return to the man's eyes. He watched him recognize the boy in front of him, groggy unease turning to anger, and then, seeing the knife, unease again. He watched him open his mouth and work his throat as if to activate his quirk, for all that he would remain unable to use fire breath now. Instead, he let out the faintest gasp as the cold metal of the curved blade came to rest, gleaming, just below his left ear. Ever so gently, Izuku cupped Hisashi's cheek and tilted his head up, to meet his gaze. He saw Mikumo's eyes soften, almost sad, before the look in them turned cold, the solidifying of his final resolve. And a wave of pure menace billowed out from him, a great dark fear that made Hisashi's eyes go wide and his pupils narrow to pinpricks, going white as a sheet in seconds even before the knife moved. It extended out of the memory even and into the dream, so that the shadows in the mist reared back, too, a great chorus of gasps. For a moment, just as he had in the memory, Even All for One flinched, feeling the pull of wakefulness that accompanied the worst of every nightmare. He had understood, in that moment, the truth of Izuku's quirk. Had known, innately, its most honest name. Midoriya Hisashi bled out well before he could drown. Mikumo used his hold on the body's face to prop him back up against the chair, then stood in silence for a long moment, staring at the blood on his arms, his shirt, his hands. "Are we done?" he whispered, echoing in the empty space. The memory faded, then, so that Izuku and the vestiges were left staring into the empty shadows of it, frozen. Izuku felt their eyes on him and didn't turn to look, because he was pretty sure he knew what expression they would wear. "I guess he did get some use out of my quirk, after all," was his last thought within the dreamscape, as it dissipated between one blink and the next and left him staring up at the plain ceiling of his room. He laid there for the span of 3 breaths, dazed. Then he laughed. He muffled the laughter into his pillow, and the sobs that followed, sobs of relief, because All for One the man had saved him twice over, sparing him the stigma of having that quirk, that most unambiguously villainous power he could possibly imagine. Of course, now he had it again. When Izuku had managed to calm himself down, he tossed the tear-soaked pillow off the side of his bed and smacked his palm on his nightstand, bleary-eyed, to find his phone so he could send a text. Before he unlocked it, though, he caught the faint scent of coffee from downstairs, a specific brand's aroma. It seemed he wasn't the only one who hadn't slept well. Shoving his feet into Eraserhead-themed slippers, he slunk down the hallway and down the stairs. Tuning into his new quirk sense only confirmed what he'd already expected. Moments before he crossed the threshold into the kitchen, Hisashi leaned against the counter, a plain mug of black coffee held out like an offering in his free hand. Izuku took it, and joined him in his leaning, staring at his reflection in the mug. "What did you name it?" he asked when the mug was empty. Somehow, All for One didn't need to ask for clarification on what he meant. "Death," he murmured, "and despair." It was deeply unusual for Todoroki Shudo to be awake before 6 in the morning, the first hour of his self-imposed routine. Ask anyone and they'd agree. In fact, any of his classmates who saw him right now, just past 4 a.m., would probably ping the entire group chat in a panic to announce that shenanigans were afoot. Then, if they weren't a coward, they might actually ask him when he woke up. The answer to which would be that he hadn't gone to. So, "It's him, All for One." "Yeah, we know." Shudo stared, first at Shinso, then at his brother, in a mute astonishment that came from being too polite to voice the words running through his head. Fortunately, Bakugo was not. "What the f do you mean, you know? And, wait, you two?" Tuya blurted out. "Sheet why?" "Once upon a time," Shinso drawled with a dry cynicism to which Shudo could acutely relate, "I had abusive, a-hole parents too." A nod toward the conspiracy wall. "And then that man came for them." Shudo was struck with a sudden, intense fantasy of looking over Endeavor's shoulder during a grueling training session in the family dojo, and seeing All for One looming there behind him. Earlier today, when Midoriya Hisashi introduced himself to everyone, Shinso went on, crossing his arms, "He mentioned my parents." The pause. "And then he talked to me with my dead mother's telepathy quirk." He crept downstairs on socked feet, relying on the dim safety lights in the stairwell, and headed for the kitchen in contemplative silence. "Thing hell," Bakugo declared, with feeling. "But wait, if that's why you know him, then he whirled on Tuya, and so did Shudo and Shinso. Why do you know?" An idea occurred to Shudo. "Did you ask him about getting rid of Endeavor? Between the two of us, we probably have enough quirks to pay for it." "I really do not recommend doing that," Shinso interrupted. "Maybe it can be a backup plan," Shudo conceded, seeing the horrified look that had crossed Tuya's face. Bakugo, meanwhile, was still glaring daggers at Tuya. "Whatever, icy hot, how about we go back to how your weird brother here knows the supervillain in the building?" Shudo watched Tuya steel himself, taking a deep breath and letting it out slowly. "Before I answer, let it be known," he began, reaching for the pouch of makeup wipes he'd left on Shudo's desk earlier, "this was a conversation I wanted to have with you earlier, in private, Otuto." He stared intently into Shudo's eyes, then, looking almost worried. What he had to be worried about, Shudo didn't know. He'd already decided would protect his brother no matter what kind of person he had become in the years since his disappearance. You can say it in front of them. They'd all find out eventually anyway. I'm bad at keeping secrets. Shinso muttered something under his breath that sounded like, "You don't say." Tuya sighed. Fair enough, and pressed one makeup-removing wipe firmly to the back of his arm. Shudo raised an eyebrow. He'd thought the scars his brother needed to cover were just on his face, but then, he should have guessed no one could really have skin that smooth. Just promise you won't let Blasty here go apes hit and blow me up. I'll ice him as needed, Shudo promised immediately. Bakugo sent him a nasty glare, but subsided. He had already been gearing up for some kind of fight, Shudo could just tell. Under everyone's collective scrutiny, Tuya wiped the makeup away. His skin was a familiar scarred purple underneath. What the F dash, someone said, and it took Shudo a moment to realize it was him. Soft murmuring reached Shudo's ears from the living room, too quiet to be intelligible from his current distance. Strange, considering the lights were out. Had someone left their phone downstairs by accident? It didn't sound like it was coming from outside. He drew nearer, smelling fresh coffee. If he wasn't dead set on the leftover cold soba in the fridge, he would probably go for a cup. Shudo turned the corner into the kitchen, to find Midoriya and All for One sitting at the kitchen table. Bakugo had been surprisingly calm in that moment, uncharacteristic of him to the point that Shudo had thought Shinso might have got him with brainwash. We need to report this to the teachers, he said, through what sounded like gritted teeth. All for One and you and the Handsby all need to go. Wait, Shinso blinked. Shigaraki is here? Toyodabi? Raised a cynical eyebrow. Is this makeup magical or something? He asked them. Surely Blasty isn't the only one who's caught on. Silence. Tuya sighed. Midoriya Tenko Greenie's older brother? Well, if he is Midoriya's father, I guess Shigaraki is his older brother, Shinso murmured. Bakugo sneered. Did you forget that BSTRD isn't his dad? Then he faltered. Deku threatened me not to say shit about that guy. Like, seriously threatened me. Yeah, we noticed, Tuya drawled. Shut the F up, Bakugo snarled, then went pink when he realized what he'd said. Shudo's brother covered his laugh in his hand. Fucking, whatever. All you villains need to F off outta here. I mean, eventually, we probably will, Shudo's brother shrugged. Tamura just dragged me here because he paused. Neither of the supposed Midoriyas seemed to have noticed him yet, quietly entrenched in a discussion on some kind of quirk theory occasionally interrupted by more coffee. With those components, it could still be viable. Midoriya held up his phone for the villain to see. They just need a support item capable of dispersing the recoil. That assumes we don't include a way to moderate the power output, which could still be done if the directionality factor was changed from field-based to point of contact, All for One muttered, peering at the screen. Or if we switched out pure force for elemental. Which defeats the purpose, since elemental was what we started with. Midoriya made a frustrated noise, and sent Black Whip out to snag the coffee pot from the countertop. He filled his cup, passed the pot to All for One, and finally looked up. Oh hey Shudo. Good morning, Shudo said, unwilling to move from the doorway. He was unnerved, because in this moment, muttering, silhouetted against the baleful light of a screen, Midoriya and his father looked catastrophically alike. Because what a-hole? Because his brother invited him, Tuya murmured, looking thoughtful. Hey, are we sure Greenie doesn't know what's going on?